The old tales speak of the 9 daughters of memory passed down through generations. If stories like this bring you peace, subscribing to Olympus Dreams means the next one finds you. Long before the 9 were named, before their voices rose above any mountain, there was a night on Mount Pieria that changed the nature of things. The accounts differ, as old accounts often do, on the precise season. Some say late summer, when the grasses on the lower slopes still held warmth from the sun. Others say it was the cusp of autumn, when the air above Macedonia carries that particular clarity, cold enough to sharpen the edges of the stars, but not cold enough to silence the crickets along the foothills. What the various tellings agree upon is this: Zeus came to Pieria on foot, without thunder, without ceremony. He came as something older than a god. He came as a mind that had grown heavy with the weight of ruling everything, and had sought out the one being who might understand that weight. Her name was Mnemosyne. They say she was already there when he arrived, seated on a high shelf of stone where the mountain curved inward like a cupped hand. She was not waiting for him in the way a mortal woman waits, with impatience or longing. She waited with the stillness of one who holds all things already within herself. For Mnemosyne was not merely old, she was memory itself, given form and breath. She was the daughter of Gaia and Uranus, born of earth and sky before their great sundering, before the sickle fell and the age of the Titans ended. Within her mind lived every moment that had ever passed. The first sound the world made, the first rain on first stone. The very instant Gaia drew her initial breath, and the mountains pushed upward through her skin, Zeus sat beside her and said nothing for a long time. The tale tells that this silence was not empty. Between a god who commands all things and a Titaness who remembers all things, silence takes on a different quality. It holds more than speech. It breathes differently. They sat together under stars that had not yet been named, on a mountain that had not yet been made sacred, and the air between them grew dense with something that had no word then. It would eventually find a word. But that word would not arrive until 9 months later, when 9 voices opened for the first time. The first night passed into the second, then the second into the third. For 9 consecutive nights Zeus remained on the slopes of Pieria with the keeper of all recollection. He spoke to her of things that troubled him, the wars behind him. The wars still forming in the distance like weather systems on the horizon, the faces of mortals he had watched rise and crumble. The difficulty of ruling a world that would not hold still long enough to be understood. Mnemosyne listened with her whole self. This was her nature and her gift. When she listened, nothing was lost. Each word Zeus placed into the air between them was received and held and woven into the larger tapestry she carried always within her mind. She did not merely hear him. She kept him, and in return she spoke. They say she spoke of what she had seen before his reign began. She had watched the Titans hold dominion over a young and formless world. She had watched her brother Cronus take the throne and swallow his own children whole, each one a future lost before it could be lived. She had watched Zeus himself emerge from concealment in Crete, grow into his power on that island's green slopes, and she had watched the Titanomachy tear the world apart and put it together again in a new shape. She had kept all of this within herself, not as a burden, but as a trust. Because she understood what is perhaps the deepest truth the old myths return to again and again. Without memory, nothing that has occurred can matter to those who come after. Without memory, the dead are simply gone. The brave lose their bravery. The lost find no mourners. The beautiful leave no trace. Zeus understood this when she said it. He had built order from chaos and law from war. But he had not yet built the means by which mortals might preserve what they learned and suffered and loved. He had not yet made the keepers of the human record. By the 9th night, the air on Mount Pieria had changed. Even the stone beneath them seemed different. Warmer, some accounts suggest, as though the mountain itself had been listening and found the conversation worthwhile. The crickets had grown louder, or perhaps silence had grown quieter around them, the way it does before something significant begins. When Zeus departed, he went back to Olympus carrying something new in his expression. The other gods noticed but did not ask. There are some encounters that announce themselves only afterward in what they produce rather than in what they were. Mnemosyne remained on Pieria for a while after he left. She sat with her hands resting open in her lap, and she felt, for the first time in her long and ancient life, something unfamiliar moving within her. It was not memory. It was not recollection or recognition. It was something pointed toward the future rather than gathered from the past. It was anticipation. Within her, in the slow and certain manner of all beginnings, 9 new lives had taken hold. The accounts do not record what she thought in those first quiet moments of understanding. But Mnemosyne was not a goddess of private feeling. She was a Titaness of vast and formal knowing, and what she understood completely. These children growing within her would be hers, in the way that no other thing in her long existence had been hers, not inherited from the primordial age, not received from Gaia or Uranus or the long chain of powers before her, made by her, made from her, made alongside the one who had come to her without ceremony on a mountain that did not yet have a name in any human tongue. They would be the bond she had made with him, given form and breath and voice. 9 of them she already sensed. 9, like the number of his nights beside her. 9, like the number of a patience fulfilled. She looked out from her shelf of stone across the lowland dark of Macedonia, and she let the oldest of her memories move through her mind like a river through familiar country. The first word ever spoken, the first song ever made by human breath, the first name given to a star. These were all inside her, and now they would have somewhere new to go. She placed both hands flat against herself, with that gesture that belongs to every age and every telling, the oldest human gesture. Older than language, older than stone carving or painted walls, she listened. And deep within the silence, something listened back. 9 small silences. 9 held breaths not yet taken. 9 futures curled like ferns before the light finds them. The mountain held them all. The mountain did not change when she rose from the stone shelf. Pieria was what it had always been, a high and patient place, dark slopes, cold upper air, the lowland of Macedonia stretching south and west beneath the stars. But Mnemosyne moved differently now, not quickly. She was not a goddess of haste or urgency. She moved with the particular deliberateness of one who carries something worth carrying carefully. She descended from the inward curve of rock, where she had sat through 9 nights of conversation, and stood for a moment on a wider ledge below. The grass there was dry with late summer. It bent under the wind without breaking. She considered what she held within herself. This is where the accounts grow thoughtful and slow. Those who preserved these stories understood that what happened next was not dramatic in the manner of battles or transformations. It was something quieter, an interior season, a long and private becoming. She began to remember, not intentionally, not as a deliberate act. Memory for her did not require intention. It moved through her the way water moves through stone over many years, finding every hollow, every fissure, every place where something might be kept. She did not summon the past. The past was simply present within her. It was her substance and her architecture. And so, as the 9 small lives within her began their slow unfurling, her oldest memories rose alongside them. She remembered the world before mountains had names. She had been there, not as a witness standing apart from events, but as a presence woven into the fabric of what was occurring. When Gaia first raised herself from the primordial dark and found form beneath the young sky, Mnemosyne had already existed in some older, less defined mode. She was Gaia's daughter, yes, and Uranus's too. But she carried something none of her siblings carried in quite the same way. She carried the record. She had kept the moment when sky first arched over earth. She had kept the first meeting of the primordial siblings. She had kept the long, groaning sorrow of Gaia bearing and rebearing her monstrous children, while Uranus pushed them back into darkness. She had kept the sound of the flint sickle, the cry that scattered across the young heavens when Cronus brought his father down. She had kept even the foam on the sea afterward, and the astonishing figure that stepped from that foam onto the shore of Cyprus. Untouched by the violence of her own origin, all of this lived within her. Now she carried 9 lives that would one day carry it further. The account suggests she walked a little that night. Not far. The mountain was dark and steep above the foothills, and the late summer crickets still sounded in the lower grasses. She moved along a natural terrace of rock and dry earth, running her hand lightly against the stone face of the slope. It is the kind of detail that survives in old tellings because it feels true to the nature of the figure described, a Titaness of Memory tracing stone with her fingers, taking in texture, keeping it. What she was beginning to understand in those slow hours was this: she had always been the preserver, the great keeper of what had occurred. That was her gift and her function and her nature. But a preserver cannot reach forward. Memory does not move ahead of events. It gathers only what has already been. These 9 within her were different. They would not only hold the past, they would do something with it. Something she had never quite done. They would take what had been kept and give it back to the living world. They would place it in the mouths of mortals, in the hands of those who shaped songs and stories and records of the dead. Mortal memory, she had long understood, was fragile. She had watched it fail. She had seen heroes die whose names no one living could recall before 3 generations passed. She had seen whole lineages of craft and knowledge dissolve when the last practitioner died without a student. Mortal minds were made of different material than her own. They held things for a while. Then the things slipped loose. These children growing within her would be the bridge. They would take what she kept in her vast and ancient interior and offer it outward, in forms that mortal tongues could carry forward. In verse, in song, in the careful record-keeping of one who sits beside a fire and names what happened and when and to whom, in the movement of a dancer whose body says what words cannot. The tales tell us she stopped walking at some point in the middle of that night. She stood on the terrace of rock with one hand still against the stone, and she looked southward. Macedonia lay below her in the darkness. Beyond it, Thessaly. Beyond that, the long body of Greece reaching south toward places she had not yet named in any register she kept, somewhere in those unmapped distances. There was a mountain she had not yet visited. She could not have said how she knew this. Memory does not typically point forward, but this was not memory. It was the same strange sensation she had noticed when Zeus departed, the one that pointed ahead rather than behind. It came to her again now, pointing south, pointing towards slopes she had not yet climbed, a mountain where something waited, a spring not yet opened, a meadow where 9 daughters of hers would one day gather and begin, together, the work they had been made for. She did not know the name of the place. She held the image of it lightly. A dark hillside, certain trees, the sound of water moving through rock, and, somewhere far ahead in time, the sound of a young man's voice raised in song on a hillside, trembling slightly, trying to name the gods and the beginning of all things. She filed the image away. She kept it. This is what Mnemosyne does. She keeps things, even things that have not yet happened. Perhaps especially those. Perhaps that is why she was chosen, above all the Titanesses and all the daughters of the primordial age, to become the mother of inspiration itself. Because she understood that what must be remembered most urgently is not what has already occurred, it is what is coming. The night deepened. The stars shifted slowly over Pieria. She remained on the terrace for a long while, her hands returned to rest against her sides. Her 9 children turned within her like the first slow movements of a thought not yet spoken. They would be needed. She understood this completely. The world of mortals was growing more complex. With every generation Zeus kept watch over it. More wars, more cities, more names requiring witnesses, more grief requiring song to make it bearable, more beauty requiring voice to make it last beyond the season of its appearing. And somewhere in the unmapped south, a mountain was waiting to receive them. She drew a long, even breath of night air. Pieria's air was sharp and clean with the approach of autumn, carrying something cold from the peaks above and something warm from the harvested lowland below. She held the breath for a moment. Then she released it into the dark, where it dissolved like a word spoken into an empty room. Spoken nonetheless, received by the mountain and the night and the long patience of time. She turned and walked back toward the stone shelf. The ferns along the terrace had not moved. They were still curled in their dark spirals, waiting for the light that would not come until morning. She looked at them without stopping. Then she continued up. She had more remembering to do before the 9 were ready. The stone beneath her feet changed as she climbed. Lower on the slope, it had been smooth in places, worn by weather across many seasons. Up here, closer to the ridge, it was rougher, more fractured, as though the mountain had not yet decided its final shape. She placed her palm against a jutting face of rock and felt the cold of it move through her hand and up her arm. The mountain had no memory of its own. Not the way she did, but it had something adjacent to memory. A record kept in mineral and fracture line. Each layer of stone a season compressed into silence. She appreciated this. She understood the stone's logic, even if the stone understood nothing of hers. She continued upward. The tales that have come down to us really speak of what existed before the 9 were born. They begin with the daughters already singing on Helicon, already crowned in laurel, already shaping the breath of poets. But the older accounts, the ones kept in places where the telling moved slowly and no one rushed toward conclusion, those speak of something prior, before the 9. There were 3. This is the tradition preserved in certain recountings associated with Mount Helicon itself, not the Helicon of Hesiod's age, full of sound and sacred springs and the names of 9 sisters braided together. The older Helicon, the quieter one. The mountain before it became what it would become. On those slopes, in the time before the great wars of Olympians and Titans had settled into story, 3 figures moved and gathered and did their slow work. They had no elaborate genealogy in the oldest telling, no named parents, no grand celestial origin. The account simply notes that they were there, that the mountain held them the way high places hold mist, naturally, without effort or explanation. Their names, in the oldest tradition, were these: melete, practice, memory, song. 3 words laid bare like foundations. Not decorative names, not the kind of names given at celebrations or inscribed on temple walls. Functional names, names that described exactly what each one did and nothing more. Melete governed the labor, the repetition. The patient returned to a difficult passage of music until the hands knew it without instruction from the mind. She moved among those who were learning, among those who had not yet achieved what they reached toward. She was not glamorous in the accounts. She was the quiet presence in the corner of the room when a young man played the same phrase on his lyre for the 30th time and finally, on the 31st, found it. Her work was slow and unwitnessed. She did not appear in paintings. She was not invoked at the beginning of a poem, but without her there was no poem, only the intention of one. Mnemo was different in character from Mnemosyne, though their natures touched at certain edges. She did not hold the vast and primordial record of all things from the first moment of existence. Her memory was smaller in scope. more intimate. She kept what had been sung, what had been played, the melodies that had moved through a room and might otherwise dissolve the moment the last note faded. She gathered these and held them. She was the reason a song heard once in childhood could rise again unbidden decades later. The reason a rhythm tapped on a drum in one village could be found, transformed, in a village many hills away. She was transmission made divine. Not grand transmission, quiet transmission. The kind that happens between people without their awareness. Aoidi was the third. Song itself given form, not singing in the sense of a performer taking the stage before a crowd. Something prior to that, the first instinct to open the mouth and let shaped sound emerge. The impulse that predates training or audience or occasion. She was present, the old accounts suggest, wherever a living thing made sound that carried beyond mere communication. Wherever a shepherd on a hillside sang to no one in particular. Wherever a woman at a loom hummed a melody without knowing she had begun to hum. Aoid was not the achievement of song, she was the compulsion toward it. These three gathered on the older Helicon in the time before the Hippocrene spring existed, before Pegasus, before the laurel groves were planted in ritual dedication. The mountain then was simply a mountain, high, wooded in places. Cold along the upper ridge in winter. The accounts do not describe it as magical. They describe it as suited, a mountain of the right height and disposition for this kind of quiet work. They did not perform for the gods. They were not called to Olympus to entertain at feasts. The tradition places them at a remove from the grand proceedings of the divine order. Their work was lower in register, more closely bound to the mortal world and its need for practiced craft and carried song. It is worth pausing on this. 3. Practice. Memory. Song. The later tradition would expand this to 9, would elaborate each domain into its own specific art. Epic poetry, history, love verse, music, tragedy, sacred hymn, Honibus, dance, comedy, astronomy, 9 distinct territories carefully mapped and named. A full accounting of the ways in which human beings give form to experience through craft. But the 3 came first, and the 3 together describe something the 9 would later be divided to express. The oldest account says it plainly. First you practice, then you remember what the practice has made possible, then you sing what memory and practice together have released. That sequence, that order, it was already present on Helicon before the 9 Muses were born. Mnemosyne did not pass through Helicon that night on Pieria. She was still on the northern slope, her hand returning to stone, her pace unchanged. But the older mountain was present somewhere in the vast interior she carried. She had filed it there long ago. The image of 3 figures moving through a wooded hillside, in the time before cities, before the wars that reorganized the heavens, before poets required 9 distinct patrons to name before beginning. 3 had been sufficient once, she wondered. Briefly and without any particular urgency, whether the 9 would exceed what the 3 had established, or whether they would simply extend it. Cover more ground, name more clearly what the 3 had held in summary. Memory does not judge between these possibilities. It holds both and waits. The ridge above her was lightning in the faintest sense, not dawn. Dawn was still a long distance away, but the very deepest part of the night had passed. Something had shifted imperceptibly in the colour of the dark, the way a held note changes when the breath behind it begins to thin. She noticed it without stopping. Her 9 children turned within her, slowly, with the unhurried quality of things not yet ready to be known. Below her, on the terrace, the ferns remained curled in their dark spirals. The stone held the cold it had accumulated through the night. The crickets in the lower grasses had grown quieter, though not yet silent. Somewhere far to the south a mountain waited. And older than that mountain, older than the spring that would one day burst from its hillside, older than the name that would one day be given to the 9 daughters she carried, 3 figures moved through a wooded slope in a time the world had mostly stopped recounting. Melete, mimeme, Aid, practice, memory, song, still there in the oldest layer of what had been kept, still present beneath the more elaborate tradition, the way the first foundation stone of a temple remains present beneath all the columns raised above it. Unseen, necessary, holding the weight of everything built on top of it without complaint or acknowledgement, she reached the upper ledge and stopped. The air here was colder. The stars above were sharp and very far away. She stood still for a moment, her hands at her sides, the 9 moving slowly within her. Then she sat down on the stone and waited for the next memory to find her. The memory came quietly, not announced, not preceded by any shift in the cold air or any movement among the 9 within her. It arrived the way most important things arrive in the accounts that have been kept of this night, without ceremony, settling into place as though it had always been there and she had only now turned to look at it. Themis had known first. The old accounts tend to agree on this. The goddess of divine law, whose sight moved not through the seen world, but through the underlying order beneath it, had perceived something forming in the deep fabric of what was coming. Not a vision exactly. The tradition does not describe it as vision. It describes it as recognition. The way a mason who has worked stone for many years knows by the sound of the chisel whether what lies beneath is solid or hollow, Themis knew the sound of what was hollow waiting to be filled. She had been sitting at the outer edge of the assembly of Olympus, apart from the feast, as was her custom, not removed from it, positioned at a slight angle to the proceedings where she could observe without being absorbed. And in that particular hour the accounts differ on which hour, but they agree on the quality of it, a stillness within the ordinary motion of Olympus. She had grown very quiet, quieter than her usual quiet. She had set down what she held. Her eyes had moved to the window of stars beyond the hall. One of the Graces, Aglaia perhaps, or Euphrosyne, the sources are not precise here, noticed the change in her. The Graces were nearby. They often were in the older accounts. Moving through celebrations and gatherings with the fluid ease of those who understand that grace is not an ornament added to occasions, but a quality without which occasions do not truly occur at all. The Grace who noticed Themis grew still herself, in the way that stillness is contagious among those sensitive to it. She looked where Themis was looking. The sky beyond Olympus was as it had been, wide and very dark. The stars in their familiar arrangements, the lyre among them, small and exact, its 4 principal stars forming their quiet quadrilateral above the horizon. But the tradition records this. 9 stars, not belonging to any established figure, had appeared near the constellation of the lyre, not in a cluster, arranged without obvious pattern, as if scattered by a hand that had not yet decided what shape it intended. They were faint. A mortal looking directly at them might not have seen them. The kind of stars that appear only when the eye looks slightly to one side, glimpsed rather than observed, but Themis had the sight for exactly this kind of thing. The nearly visible, the not yet declared. She said nothing aloud. The accounts do not record her speaking. Only the gesture. She raised one hand, not pointing, only lifting, a small movement that acknowledged without naming. The way one might acknowledge a sound heard in another room, not yet certain of its source, not yet ready to call it by name. The Grace beside her saw the gesture and understood, or partly understood. She placed her hand on the shoulder of the nearest sister and tilted her head slightly toward the window, and in this way the awareness moved among the 3 of them, quiet, lateral. The way water moves through a cloth. On Olympus the feast continued. The voices and laughter, and the particular gold warmth of that hall, carried forward without interruption. No one paused their cup. No one turned from their conversation. except Apollo. He was on one side of the hall, his lyre across his knee, not performing. The god of light and music kept his instrument close the way certain craftsmen keep their tools near them, even when the work is finished, as a matter of disposition rather than need. He had been speaking with someone. Hephaestus, one account suggests. Another says Hermes. The specific conversation does not appear to have been preserved. What was preserved is this: Apollo stopped mid-phrase. Not dramatically, not with any outward signal of disturbance. He simply went quiet, as a lyre goes quiet when the hand that was about to pluck the string pauses instead above the strings without touching them. His head inclined very slightly, the way a musician inclines when listening for a pitch that has not yet sounded, the attitude of someone tuning to a frequency not yet audible. He remained in that attitude for a moment. Then he turned and looked toward the window of stars. The 9 faint lights near the constellation of the Lyre were there. He saw them. Whether he understood what he saw, the tradition does not say plainly. It says only that he looked at them for longer than one would look at ordinary stars, and that when he finally returned his attention to the hall, he did not resume the interrupted sentence. He placed his hand flat on the body of his lyre instead, very lightly, the way one keeps a hand on something to feel if it is vibrating. It was not vibrating. Not yet. The accounts that mention this moment tend to treat it as what it is, a foreshadowing. A pause before a note. The recognition, on the part of one who has devoted his entire nature to sound, that something is gathering at the edge of hearing. Something that will, when it arrives fully, change the way sound moves through the world. He did not know, in that moment, that he would one day stand on a mountain to the south and hear 9 voices braided together and set down his lyre so he could simply listen. He did not know yet the name Musagetes, leader of the Muses, the title that would attach to him when the daughters of Mnemosyne had found their home, and he had found his way to them. These things were not yet formed. But the hand on the lyre remained, still and attentive. On the upper ledge of the northern slope, Mnemosyne sat on the cold stone and held this memory carefully. The feast on Olympus. Themis with her hand lifted, the Graces passing awareness between them without words. Apollo pausing above the strings. 9 faint stars near the lyre. She turned the memory the way one turns a stone found in a riverbed, examining it from more than one angle without trying to make it into something it had not been. It had been, the accounts suggest, a night of quiet omens, the kind that are recognized only afterward, once what was foreshadowed has come to pass, and someone versed in keeping records goes back through what was noticed and sees the shape it had always held. The 9 within her turned slowly. Far to the south the mountain waited, and near the constellation of the Lyre, if one knew how to look and where to look. And with what kind of patient, sidelong attention 9 faint stars held their scattered positions in the dark, not yet a pattern, not yet a name, waiting for the world to grow ready to call them by what they were. The night on the northern slope did not end so much as it deepened. Mnemosyne remained on the cold stone, and the cold stone held her without complaint. She had sat on harder things. She had outlasted longer vigils than this one. The accounts say very little about what she felt in those final hours before the births. The tradition is more comfortable with great events than with the waiting before them. Scribes preferred to record arrivals rather than the last quiet moments of anticipation. What is preserved is mostly this: she sat. The mountain held still beneath her. The sky above Pieria was very dark and very wide. Then, as certain records describe it simply and without elaboration, the first came. There was no storm, no column of light, no voice from Olympus announcing the moment. The tradition is consistent on this point across its various versions. The births on the slopes of Pieria were quiet, the way a spring is quiet when it first surfaces, not the roaring of a river, but the small, initial emergence of water from stone, modest and certain. The first daughter came with a voice already formed, not a cry precisely, something between breath and tone, a sound that moved the nearby grasses without wind. Mnemosyne received her and held her close, and the accounts record only that the daughter's first sound was long and sustained and clear, that it carried up the slope and out across the Macedonian dark without diminishing. This was Calliope. Her name, as scholars have preserved it, carries the meaning of beautiful voice. She arrived with that voice already functional, already reaching. The accounts that attempt to describe her first sound consistently fail to find adequate comparisons. One old record tries, like the first bar of an unheard song, beginning in the middle. Another, the way a line of great verse feels when it arrives whole in the mind of the poet who did not expect it. Neither quite satisfies. The tradition acknowledges this and stops trying. Calliope lay quiet after that first sound, her eyes open. Mnemosyne kept one hand beneath her head and turned her attention to what was continuing. The mountains settled, the sky held. They came in the way the 9 nights had preceded them, one after another. Not rushed, measured. Each birth complete in itself before the next began, as though the world required a small interval to accommodate each new nature before another arrived. Clio came second, and she came. The records say, with a manner of stillness unusual in a newborn, already attending, already listening outward, her gaze moving across the landscape of Pieria with what one account calls the expression of someone taking careful note. Euterpe arrived with sound also, though different from Calliope's. Not a single sustained tone, but something more varied. A small melodic movement, brief and unresolved, ending as though it had simply paused to hear what would follow. The accounts differ on the precise order of the others. The tradition is careful to acknowledge this uncertainty. What the sources agree on is the general character of each arrival. Erato came with a warmth that the cold slope could not quite account for. The stone beneath Mnemosyne's hand was no warmer than it had been, but something in the immediate air shifted. Polyhymnia arrived without sound, which several accounts note as remarkable. She was present, and then she was more present. Her eyes, when they opened, were already turned inward, already occupied with something the outer world was not yet supplying. Terpsichore, the accounts suggest, did not remain still after her arrival. Her feet moved, not walking, not yet, but a small rhythmic flexion, a response to something unheard. Melpomene came with a quality the accounts find difficult to name. One older text says, a gravity not proportionate to her size, which is perhaps the best the tradition could manage. Thalia arrived, and the wild flowers growing in the crevices of the nearby stone opened slightly, though there was no sun to prompt them. This detail appears in 3 separate accounts and is not explained by any of them. Urania opened her eyes and looked immediately upward. The accounts are unanimous on this. She did not look at her mother, not first. Her gaze went to the sky above Pieria, to the stars still visible in the deep night, and she moved her lips as though counting something or naming something or both at once. The 9th came last. The accounts do not consistently name the order of the middle daughters, but they agree that Calliope was first and that the 9th, whichever she was in the various traditions, completed the arrival with a final quiet that was different from the silence before. The silence before had been anticipatory. This silence was full. Mnemosyne held all 9 within the compass of her arms, which is not literally possible, and which the tradition does not offer as a literal description. It is the kind of statement that means something other than what it literally says. All 9 were present. All 9 were known to her. All 9 were held in the way that only a Titaness of Memory could hold 9 new things at once, completely, without confusion. Each one distinct, and each one contained within the whole. Zeus had given 9 nights. Mnemosyne had made 9 daughters. The accounts note this proportionality without commentary. The tradition seems to find it sufficient. It was still dark when he named them. The accounts differ slightly on whether Zeus came to the slope or whether the naming happened at a distance, the way divine declarations sometimes do, present everywhere the declaration is relevant, without requiring a body standing in a particular location. The tradition leans toward the latter. He did not come down from Olympus that night, but the name arrived. The Mnemosyne, the daughters of inspiration. The accounts preserve various explanations for the root of the word. Most link it to memory, to longing, to the mind reaching toward what it does not yet hold. The name settled over all 9 at once, a collective name which was fitting. They had arrived separately and distinctly, but they were also, and would always be, together. Mnemosyne held the name the way she held everything, carefully, without collapsing it into something simpler. It meant 9 things and 1 thing simultaneously, and she was precisely equipped to hold that complexity without resolving it prematurely. Far to the north and above, the 9 faint stars near the constellation of the lyre continued to hold their scattered positions. Mnemosyne, without lifting her eyes from the daughters in her arms, was aware of them. The stars were no brighter than they had been, but they were perhaps slightly more settled, as though they too had received something they had been waiting to receive. A correspondence, a confirmation. On Olympus, the feast had long wound its way through the night's later hours. The accounts do not say whether the hall had quieted by then or still carried its gold warmth. They record only Apollo, still on the far side of the hall, his hand still resting flat on the body of the lyre, not pressing, not preparing to play, simply resting there in the attitude of a listener who does not yet know exactly what he is listening for, but who is patient enough to remain still until the sound resolves into something nameable. Pieria held all 9. The cold slope was the first ground that knew their weight, and on the mountain that waited far to the south, the one whose name had not yet been spoken in connection with them, whose spring had not yet been struck open by a winged horse not yet born. The grass on the upper slopes lay undisturbed in the dark, unhurried, holding its shape. The light on Mount Pieria did not change all at once. It shifted by degrees. The deep black of the night's latest hours gave way first to a darkness that was simply less absolute, then to a grey that had no colour in it yet, then gradually to a grey with the faintest suggestion of blue along the eastern horizon. The accounts record that this happened while Mnemosyne and the 9 were still on the slope. The Titaness had not moved from the stone. Her daughters were arranged around her in the way that new things arrange themselves without plan, drawn by proximity to the source of them, settling where settling was possible. What the accounts record next is the singing. The tradition preserves some disagreement about how it began. One text says Calliope simply opened her mouth, the way she had done at the moment of her birth, and the sound came out of her fully formed. Another account suggests it was Euterpe who found the first thread. The same brief melodic movement she had made in her earliest moments, now extended, drawn out into something longer. A third source, older and less detailed than the others, says only that the singing began, and that this was sufficient. What the accounts agree upon is this: all 9 sang. Not in sequence, not taking turns, together. The sound was not loud. It was, by every description, quite modest in its initial volume. A group of 9 new voices on a cold hillside in the last moments before dawn. The slope around them was still dark. The stone beneath them still held its winter chill, but the singing carried. The tradition is careful here. It does not claim the sound travelled instantaneously, the way lightning moves, or the way divine will sometimes operates. The accounts describe instead a gradual arrival, something reaching across a great distance, not in a single moment, but the way light reaches, steadily, moving through the medium between one point and another, arriving in degrees, On Olympus, Apollo became aware of it before he could have named what he was aware of. His hand was still on the lyre. It had been there through the long hours of the feast. He had not slept. The accounts do not speculate about why, but they record the posture consistently, seated, hand flat against the instrument, not playing. A stillness that had persisted long enough to be remarked upon by others in the hall. Then something altered in his attention. The accounts describe it carefully, because they understand it is a small thing and they do not want to overstate it. His head did not turn. He did not stand. He gave no visible sign that any external thing had reached him. But the quality of his stillness changed. A listener who was simply waiting became a listener who was receiving something. The lyre, several accounts note, produced no sound at this moment. Apollo's hand had not moved. But Hermes, who was crossing the hall at that particular instant, stopped walking. He stood in the middle of the great floor and held very still in the way that Hermes almost never held still. A pause in a figure whose nature is continuous motion. The accounts find this significant and do not explain it further. Zeus, seated at the long table, smiled, not the wide expression of pleasure that the tradition sometimes assigns to him. A slow, private movement at the corner of the mouth, the kind of expression that belongs to a recognition rather than a surprise. He had known what would come from those 9 nights on Pieria, but knowing and hearing are different things. Even for Zeus they are different things. The accounts say he did not speak. He simply smiled, and then he reached for his cup, and the motion was unhurried. What the 9 were singing on the slopes of Pieria was not, the tradition is careful to note, a song they had composed. They were too new for composition in that sense. They had not yet had occasion to choose a subject, to arrange words in sequence, to decide on a beginning and an end. The singing was something else, something prior to intention. One older commentary on these events describes it as the voice reaching toward its own nature, the Muses singing not of something, but from something. The sound moving outward from them, the way warmth moves from a fire, not aimed, not controlled, simply the natural expression of a thing that generates heat. But the accounts record also this, that within the sound certain shapes were present, not words. Not yet, but configurations of tone that the tradition, looking backward with the advantage of knowing what came after, finds itself compelled to name. There was a shape that suggested distance, a long sustained note in Calliope's register, lower than the others, that carried within it the sense of a plane seen from a great height. The accounts do not say which plane. But the word Troy does not appear for many generations of mortal time after this night, and yet one scholar of the later period, reading the descriptions, writes in his notes, one recognizes the shape, though one cannot say how. There was a shape also that suggested water, specifically salt water, specifically the movement of a ship on open sea. Euterpe's melodic thread, extended now into something more developed, carried this quality. The tradition that reads this backward sees the wine-dark sea as Homer would one day describe it. The tradition also reminds itself that Homer had not yet been born, and would not be for a very long time, and that the Muses were not prophesying. They were only singing from within themselves, and what was within them was what they had been made to hold. Terpsichore's feet, the accounts note, were moving now. Not the small rhythmic flexion of her birth, but something fuller, a pattern. Repeated, then varied, then returned to. This too the tradition reads as significant and does not explain. There was a third shape in the singing that the accounts name only obliquely. They say, a heaviness not native to the hour. A grief note, they call it in one text. In another, a weight that seemed disproportionate to the singers, who were very new and had not yet experienced loss. The accounts attribute this note to Melpomene, which is consistent with what the tradition would later understand about her nature, but they do not say what the grief was for. The morning light continued to arrive. The sky above Pieria moved through its gradual colours. The 9 voices rose and fell on the cold hillside. Mnemosyne held still on the stone at the centre of them. Far to the south, the mountain that had been nameless in connection with them throughout these preceding nights lay in its own particular early quiet. On its upper slopes, where the grass had lain undisturbed, something moved, not a person, not an animal, a tremor in the ground, faint as breath. One account places this exactly at the moment the grief note entered the singing of the 9. Another account does not mention it at all. The winged horse was not yet born. The spring was not yet struck open. The mountain's name had not yet been added to the list of places where the Mnemosyne would one day be known, but the ground moved once, slightly, and then was still. Apollo, on Olympus, lifted his hand from the lyre, not to play, to hold the hand slightly above the strings, a position of readiness, of imminent beginning. The accounts do not record what note he played next, or whether he played at all in that moment. They only record the hand lifted, and the listening face, and the slow, clear attention of a god who had heard something he already knew he would hear again. The 9 left Pieria as the morning settled fully into itself, the cold still lodged in the stone and the earth, but the light now clear and long across the northern slopes. They did not hurry. The tradition notes this with a particularity that suggests it was understood as meaningful. The daughters of Zeus and Mnemosyne were not travellers in any urgent sense. They were, the accounts say, discovering. The road southward from Pieria was not yet a road when they first walked it. It was the land itself, unimproved, the ground falling away through Macedonia toward the valleys of Thessaly in long, unhurried descents. The Muses move through it with the quality of those who notice everything they pass and stop, often without explanation. Calliope stopped first. She stopped at a river, a narrow one, running cold and quick over pale stone. She stood at its edge for a long time. The accounts do not record what she was composing. They only record that she stood, and that her lips moved slightly, and that the water continued past her without altering its pace. Whatever she found at that river, she carried it onward inside her, unspoken. Urania walked with her face tilted at an angle that was not quite toward the ground and not quite toward the sky. The accounts say she watched the way light fell through the canopy of trees that lined the lower slopes of Macedonia. She was calculating, the tradition suggests, though the word feels too cold for what the descriptions imply. She was more likely tracking, following the angle of the sun's passage and matching it against the positions she had already fixed in her understanding of the vault above. Even walking, even in daylight, she was reading the sky. Terpsichore did not walk through the meadows they passed. She moved through them by a different method. The pattern she had found on Pieria in the last hours of the night before departure was still active in her feet. The accounts describe this carefully. It was not a performance. There was no one watching, or rather no one whose watching concerned her. The pattern was an inquiry. She was working something out through her body that could not yet be worked out through thought. By the time the Muses descended into the first wide valley of Thessaly, the sun had moved considerably and the air had changed. The cold of the northern slopes was gone. In its place, the valley offered a warmer stillness, a denseness of grass and flower that had a different quality entirely from the sparse, stony hillside where they had been born. Thalia walked into this valley and laughed, not loudly. A single, rounded sound of delight. The wild flowers in the meadow immediately surrounding her feet opened fractionally wider, the accounts note, which 2 commentators call coincidence, and a third calls simply consistent with what one would expect. Erato had been quiet since leaving Pieria. She was the last to descend into the valley, and the first to look back toward the north. The accounts describe her expression in that moment as one of recognition, which seems strange given she had only just left the place she was looking toward. Perhaps she was recognizing not a place but a feeling. The particular quality of absence that follows, an arrival, the way a beginning carries within it the first trace of its own ending. Polyhymnia had spoken very little throughout the southward walk. This was not unusual. Even in the accounts of her earliest days, she is the most interior of the 9. She walked in the middle of the group, not at its edge, and she watched her sisters with a sustained, unhurried attention. The tradition does not record her thoughts. It records only that she carried something in her hands throughout the walk, a stone from Pieria, smooth, grey, the size of a palm. She had taken it without remark, and she carried it without remark, and the accounts say she would eventually place it at the edge of the spring on the mountain they were walking toward. Though she did not yet know this, Melpomene walked beside Clio, and this pairing is noted in more than one account as if it were already understood to be characteristic. Clio moved through the landscape with her attention organized. She was noting things. The names of the rivers they crossed, the shapes of the hills, the way the seasons had moved through this southern country and left their evidence in the colour of the vegetation. She was compiling, the tradition says. Melpomene walked beside her and said nothing about the grief note that was still present somewhere inside her chest, heavier than the morning warranted, unnamed. Euterpe found the sea before the others, or rather she heard it before the others registered there was anything to hear. They had not yet come close to any coast. The accounts are uncertain about the geography of this moment. But something in the air reached Euterpe when they crossed into a higher meadow on the Thessalian side, and the melodic thread she had been carrying since Pieria, the one the tradition would read backward as salt water, and the movement of a ship, opened wider in her chest. She did not speak of it. She only breathed differently for several steps, and the grass on either side of her swayed once in an otherwise still afternoon. They came at dusk to a long meadow at the foot of Thessaly, and here Terpsichore stopped walking. The light was low and amber, running flat across the grass, and she turned to face it. The pattern in her feet found its fullest expression in that moment. The accounts describe what followed with a careful simplicity. She danced alone, not for her sisters who watched, and not despite them. Simply in the quality of that light, in the silence of that particular hour, the inquiry her body had been conducting since Pieria arrived at something, not an answer. A doorway. By nightfall the 9 had made their camp on the hillside, if camp is the right word for the way they settled into the grass and the cooling dark. Urania named the constellations above them, not for instruction. For herself. The names came from her the way the singing had come the night before, not aimed at anyone. Simply the natural expression of a nature that holds those shapes. The mountain that would one day be called Helicon lay farther south. They were not yet close to it, but in the long silence before the 9 stilled into their own quiet, Calliope sat slightly apart from her sisters on the slope, her hand resting on the grass beside her. Not composing, not yet. The distance she had felt at that northern river was still present in her, vast and unhurried, and she had begun to understand that it was not a feeling she was having, but a space she was becoming. The space where a very long story might one day choose to begin. The morning after, the road from Dorium crossed the lower Thessalian plain in a long westward curve. The Muses had resumed walking before the dew lifted. Polyhymnia still carried her stone. Clio had already begun naming the hills on the southern horizon. Melpomene walked beside her, and the grief note she had carried since the previous evening had not lightened, though she had not named it to anyone. It was Clio who noticed the man first. He was coming from the west, on the same road, moving toward them with the particular confidence of someone who has travelled this ground before and expects no obstacle. The tradition names him clearly, Thamyris of Thrace, the bard whom Homer would later call by name in the 9th book of the Iliad, placing him in that short and significant catalogue of those who came to grief through pride. He carried a lyre. He was known from Macedonia to Corinth. Poets praised him. Kings had fed him at their tables. He sang, the accounts agree, with a beauty that had not yet met its limit in any human ear. He saw the 9 women on the road, and he slowed, not from caution, from appreciation. He took in their manner, their bearing, the way they moved together and apart. He did not know them by sight, the tradition is careful to note. He knew them by reputation. He had heard their names spoken. He simply had not, until this moment, believed the full reach of the claim. The accounts are divided on what he said first. Some versions record a formal greeting. Others suggest he opened with a declaration and omitted the greeting entirely. The most frequently cited text places his words this way, that he had sought them, that he had something to say, and he wished the nymphs of this plain to serve as witnesses. The 9 Muses stopped walking. They arranged themselves, not deliberately, simply by the way their natures organized them in any moment of stillness, Calliope near the center, Urania slightly behind, her face tilted upward as though cross-referencing the sky, Thalia to the left, her expression neutral, Melpomene to the right, watching. Thamyris spoke plainly. He said that he could surpass them, that his voice was greater, that if they cared to contest it, he was prepared to do so here, on this road, before whatever witness the plain provided. The Muses listened without interruption. The tradition notes their expressions with some care. Not anger. The accounts are uniform on this point. Not anger, not amusement, not contempt. Something more difficult to name. Clio, the record says, looked at Thamyris the way she looked at evidence, steadily, gathering information, arriving at no conclusion that was not yet warranted. Polyhymnia simply held her stone. Calliope's expression, the tradition describes with one word, attentive. She was listening, but not only to what Thamyris had said. She was already hearing what the next several hours would produce. They accepted his challenge. Thamyris sang first. The accounts do not diminish him in this part of the telling. He was, the tradition concedes, extraordinary. His lyre had been built from a wood that held the resonance longer than ordinary timber. His voice had the quality of something shaped over years, refined through performance, hardened into a particular brilliance by thousands of hours of repetition. What he sang was a hymn to the morning, to the light across the plain, to the birds in the grasses, to the way the air moved differently in the hour after dawn than in any other hour. He had observed these things. His song made the observation felt. Several of the nymphs of the Thessalian plain, who had gathered at the edges of the road as he promised they would, wept quietly. One of them, the accounts note, touched her own face afterward, as though confirming she was still present. When he finished, he looked at the 9. There was a pause. The tradition does not specify its length. Long enough, one commentator suggests, for Thamyris to begin feeling something he had not expected to feel, the first intimation that a pause like this, following his singing, was not entirely a good sign. Then the Muses opened their mouths. The accounts struggle here. Multiple versions acknowledge, with a kind of textual candour, that language is insufficient for this part. What the tradition offers is this: the sound was not louder than Thamyris had produced. It was not more technically elaborate, but it occupied a different order of magnitude entirely, the way that the ocean and a skilled painter's rendering of the ocean occupy different categories of thing, regardless of the painter's skill. What the 9 Muses sang on that road from Dorium was not a performance. It was the original material from which performance is, at best, a distant echo. Every bird on the plain went silent. The nymphs who had wept at Thamyris's song stood now with dry eyes and open mouths, because weeping requires a certain kind of distance from the thing being experienced. And the distance had collapsed entirely. Clio alone among the 9 kept her eyes open during the singing. Her expression throughout was one of confirmation. Thamyris did not weep. He stood very still. When the singing ended, the nymphs gave their judgment without deliberation. The tradition records no discussion among them. There was nothing to discuss. What happened next, Homer records briefly, and the later accounts fill in with varying detail. The Muses took from Thamyris the gift they had not given him, but which had come, as all mortal gifts come, from the same source from which they themselves had come, his voice, his sight, the music that had lived in his hands since boyhood. The accounts are not elaborate about the manner of this. What they record is the result. He stood on the road from Dorium without these things, and the absence was total. It is worth sitting with what the tradition does not say here. It does not say the Muses were cruel. It does not say they enjoyed what followed the contest. Calliope, the tradition notes in a single line, turned south before the others. She was already walking before the moment was fully over. The space she had been becoming since the northern river held what had just occurred, the way a large vessel holds a small stone dropped into it. The water closes over. The stone rests at the bottom. The surface returns to itself. Melpomene was the last to turn south. The grief note in her chest had acquired a name now, or something close to a name. She did not speak it. She simply walked with it, the way she had walked since Pieria. The road from Dorium continued. The Muses walked south. Polyhymnia shifted the stone in her hands from her left to her right and said nothing. The plain opened ahead of them. Mount Helicon was still distant. The morning light had reached its full height, and the shadows were short, and the grass on either side of the road held the warmth of a cloudless noon. Behind them, on the road where the contest had taken place, a lyre sat in the dust of the Thessalian plain, unclaimed. The wind moved across its strings once, without producing any particular note. Then the wind moved on. The road from Dorium stretched southward, and the 9 Muses walked it in a quiet that was different from the quiet that had preceded Thamyris. That earlier silence had been anticipatory, a held breath before something. This silence was the kind that follows completion. It had weight and texture. It settled around each of them the way warm air settles at the end of a long day, not oppressive but present, definite. Calliope led without announcing that she led. She had simply turned south first, and the others had followed in the natural way that water follows a first channel. Her steps were unhurried. The plain opened before her, wide and golden-grassed under the noon light. And she moved through it the way she moved through silence generally, with full attention and no rush. Urania walked with her face tilted slightly upward, though the sky offered her nothing new. Cloudless. Blue in that particular way that high summer blue announces itself, not pale, not dark, but settled into itself. She had been reading the sky for landmarks since before Pieria, habit and nature interchangeable in her by now, and the sky above this stretch of the Thessalian plain confirmed what she already knew. They were moving in the right direction. At the right hour, under the right conditions. She did not share this observation. It did not require sharing. Clio walked with her eyes open and moving across the landscape the way they always moved, inventorying, recording, noting without judgment. The grasses to the left of the road, the particular angle of the light on a low hillside to the east. The way the road itself narrowed briefly at a bend before widening again into a broader track of pale dust. She had noted the lyre they left behind. She had noted Thamyris's stillness as they turned away. She filed these things alongside all other things, without hierarchy, without emotional inflection. Events were events. The tradition would decide later what weight to assign them. Terpsichore had not danced since before the contest. This was unusual for her. Normally, by mid-morning, she would have broken from the walking at least once, would have traced something in the air with a wrist or shoulder. Some small involuntary expression of rhythm finding its way out through her body. But the hour following the contest moved differently than ordinary hours, and even Terpsichore felt the difference in her limbs. She walked steadily. Her feet, at least, maintained their natural eloquence, the way each step placed itself with the precision that was not effort, but simply her nature moving at a lower volume. Erato hummed. Barely. The sound was more vibration than note, something she did without deciding to do it, like breathing. It was not a recognizable melody. It was the sound of a mind working through something it had not yet resolved into language or form. The humming moved beside her like a thread she was following by touch. Thalia spoke first, though what she said was not loud and was not meant for all of them. She said it to Euterpe, who walked at her left shoulder. One note survived. Euterpe considered this for several steps. Then she nodded once. They both understood what she meant. Somewhere in the empty space Thamyris's song had occupied, something small persisted. Not because the song had been sufficient, because beauty, even insufficient beauty, leaves a residue. This is one of the harder facts about song. Thalia understood it with the part of her that understood comedy, which is to say, she understood it fully. Because comedy requires absolute clarity about the distance between what things aspire to be and what they are. Polyhymnia held the stone in her right hand now. She had made the transfer from left to right somewhere after the contest, without ceremony. The stone was smooth and slightly warm from her palm, a small pale thing she had carried since the previous evening. She did not think about why she carried it. She carried it because she had picked it up, and because it fit precisely into her hand, and because there was something about its silence that she found appropriate. Of all the 9, Polyhymnia was the most comfortable with silence, which is perhaps why sacred hymns had claimed her rather than the louder arts. A hymn requires the silence around it to be felt. The silence gives the hymn its proportions. Without sufficient silence, a hymn is merely text. She turned the stone once in her palm. The warmth had moved through it evenly now. It was entirely her temperature. Melpomene walked with the grief note that had ridden in her chest since Pieria, and now the note had something close to a name. She had not spoken the name. She was not certain it was fully a name yet. It was more the shape a name has, the feeling of specific weight, the way certain griefs become distinct from the general category of grief once they accumulate enough particularity. The grief that attended what had happened on the road from Dorium was not Thamyris's alone. It was the grief of all that singing represented, of all the hours a mortal spends building something toward a standard they cannot see clearly enough to know they will not reach. She did not pity him. Pity requires a kind of distance she did not feel. She simply carried the name-shaped weight and walked. Ahead, the plain curved gently south, and beyond the curve, the land began to lift. It was not yet Helicon. Helicon was still hours distant, a blue suggestion at the southern horizon, but the plain was already beginning to remember the mountains. The grasses grew shorter and stiffer. The road rose and fell in longer, slower undulations. Small stones appeared in the dust that had not been there on the northern stretches. A spring appeared at the roadside, fed from somewhere underground. Its surface perfectly still in the windless noon. The Muses slowed as they passed it. Not because they stopped, simply because stillness, when encountered, has a gravity. Each of them felt it. Urania glanced downward briefly from her sky-tilted gaze. In the water's surface, the cloudless sky was reproduced exactly. 2 white birds rose from the grasses near the spring and flew south. They crossed the road ahead of the Muses at a low altitude, wings unhurried, and disappeared into the shimmer of the afternoon distance. Calliope watched them go. The tradition does not record what she thought as she watched. It records only that she kept walking. The road bent south around a low outcropping of pale limestone, and the dust on the far side of the bend was finer, more powdery, the kind that settles into the creases of sandals and lies there without weight. Calliope noticed this without remarking on it. She noticed most things without remarking on them. This was her nature, the accumulation of detail in silence, the way an epic poet stores the world before the first word is committed. Clio walked at her right side now. She had catalogued the spring, the birds, the limestone outcropping, the change in dust, each item placed in its proper order inside her, not as a list but as a sequence. Sequence was Clio's particular relationship to the world, not cause and effect exactly. More like this, and then this, and then this. History is not a web, she believed. It is a line. The line bends, doubles back, obscures itself in places, but it does not branch. What happens, happens once, in a specific direction. She kept this thought to herself. The others understood it differently. The afternoon deepened without drama. The sun moved at its slow, indifferent pace. Shadows shortened and then began, almost imperceptibly, to lengthen again. Calliope felt the shift first. The tales are consistent on this point. The accounts drawn from various traditions do not agree on exactly where the road ran through Thessaly that particular day, nor on what season it was beyond the general understanding of summer. But they agree that somewhere south of the roadside spring something changed inside Calliope, not in her step, not in her expression. Inside, in the place where the next line of a poem waits before, it is a poem. That place moved. She placed her hand briefly against her own sternum. Then she lowered it. Euterpe noticed this. She noticed it the way one musician notices another musician pause mid-phrase. The observation was involuntary. She said nothing. The tradition holds that Calliope had known, in some sense, since Pieria. Perhaps even before Pieria. A muse does not receive the future the way a prophet does, not as images or voices or sudden clarity. She receives it the way a song receives its final note long before it is sung, as a structural necessity. The ending is already inside the beginning. Calliope had understood, with the part of her that understood endings, that something was moving toward her through time. She had not named it. Naming a thing before it arrives is not accuracy, it is impatience. But now the thing was near enough that it had begun to cast a quality of light. She kept walking. The road lifted slightly. The plain to the west spread wider as the road climbed. Helicon remained where it had been, blue and unhurried against the horizon, closer by some small measure now. The records do not say exactly when she understood. Some tellings place it at dusk, when the Muses stopped to rest on a slope above a shallow river. Others suggest it came still later in the dark, while the others slept and Calliope sat apart. But the older accounts, the ones that carry the dry, careful weight of long transmission, place it in the afternoon, on the road, in motion, in the full and ordinary light of a cloudless summer day. What she understood was this: she was carrying something. Not in her hands, not in her chest precisely. More like the way a river carries what it will eventually deposit at the sea. The thing inside her was not yet a child. It was not yet anything the world had a name for, but it had weight and direction, and a quality she recognized as distinct from herself, the way a single instrument is distinct from the piece of music it is playing. Calliope had heard mortal infants cry before. She had heard them in the villages the Muses passed, in the small sounds that drifted from low doorways at dawn. They cried with a sound that was entirely need. Pure, unformed, urgent. The need to be known, to be held, to be confirmed as present. She had listened to these sounds with the attention she gave to all sounds, with professional respect. With something else she did not name. What she felt now on the road south in the powdery dust was the premonition of a different sound. Not a cry of need. Something that would carry, from its very first moment, a curvature. A shape. The mortal world had produced beautiful singers, Thamyris among them. She had heard what mortal talent could accomplish, the extraordinary heights a human voice or hand could reach when committed absolutely to the act of song. She had heard that ceiling. She knew its precise altitude. What she carried would not encounter that ceiling. What she carried would move through it, as though it were not there. She understood this the way she understood all things that were both gift and consequence. Completely, without comfort. Melpomene, walking several paces behind, felt the texture of the air shift. She looked up. Calliope's back was unchanged, her shoulders level, her pace steady. A grief note in Melpomene's chest resonated once without obvious reason, and then settled. She had learned not to question these resonances. They came from a place deeper than intention. Terpsichore at last moved. It was small. A rotation of the right wrist, barely perceptible, the way a bird adjusts its wing against an air current without interrupting flight. She did not stop walking. Her feet continued their precise, undeliberate eloquence on the dusty road, but the wrist moved, and the movement was unmistakably hers, unmistakably dance, because dance. For Terpsichore was not performance but syntax, the body's native grammar for things. The voice has not yet found its way to saying. Erato's humming changed pitch. Almost nothing. A semitone upward held, then released. The thread she had been following by touch had turned a corner, and she had turned with it. Polyhymnia closed her fingers around the pale stone. Not tightly. The way one closes a hand around a flame that cannot burn but still requires acknowledgment. Calliope said nothing to any of them. The tradition is clear that she walked in silence for the remaining hours of that afternoon, and that she did not speak of what she carried until much later. Some accounts suggest she did not speak of it at all, that the only statement she made was eventual and biological, and required no language. But this is what the older tellings hold, that on the road south toward Helicon, beneath the full and steady light of a summer afternoon, the muse of epic poetry understood that she was the means by which the gift would cross into mortal flesh. All the singing the world had ever heard had come from outside, had entered mortal hands and throats from above, from breath, from inspiration. What she carried was different. This would be the gift housed inside mortal bones, born from them, speaking from inside the life of a man who would walk on actual earth and breathe actual air, and one day descend, as the old stories would tell it, through actual stone into actual darkness, with his lyre in his hands and a name on his lips. The first note of that song was already inside her. She could not hear it yet, but she knew its shape. Helicon deepened on the horizon. Its blue became, by imperceptible degrees, more green. Clio noted the change in colour without speaking. The road went on. The road reached the shallow river before the sun touched the western ridgeline. It was not a dramatic crossing. The water ran low at midsummer, clear and barely ankle-deep, moving over pale stones with a sound that was less than music and more than silence. Terpsichore was first across, her feet finding the stones without looking, the way one reads a familiar page. Clio followed, careful, noting the depth, noting the colour of the sediment. Calliope walked through without slowing. The far bank rose gently into a shelf of open ground. Grass grew there in thin clumps, the kind that survives hard summers by going sparse and deep. A few goats had been through recently. Their prints pressed small crescents into the softer soil near the water's edge. This is where the accounts place the encounter, though the accounts do not agree on every particular. Some of the older tellings describe the man as already visible when the Muses crossed. A figure on the slope above the river shelf, seated, his flock spread loosely around him in the late afternoon light. Others suggest the Muses had walked some distance from the bank before they noticed him. The Boeotian tradition, which is perhaps the most careful on this point, says simply that he was there when they arrived, as though the slope had produced him the way it produced its sparse grass, unremarkably. In the ordinary way of things, his name was Hesiod. He was a shepherd of Askra, a village of no particular distinction on the lower slopes of Helicon. He was not a king's son. He was not trained in any formal tradition of song. He tended goats on hillsides, and knew the rhythms of the agricultural year with the closeness of someone whose life depends on reading them correctly. What he had beyond this is harder to name. An attention, perhaps. A habit of noticing what other men let pass. He had been watching the road from Thessaly all afternoon without particular purpose. This, too, is noted in some tellings, that he was watching without knowing what he watched for. He saw 9 women cross the river. The accounts do not record what he made of them in that first moment. He was a practical man, and the tellings preserved this quality in him. He did not immediately understand what he was seeing. He watched. He remained still, the way one remains still when an understanding is forming that has not yet fully formed. Calliope reached the shelf of open ground and stopped. She turned and looked up the slope. The others gathered beside her and behind her, finding their own distances from the stillness she created. Polyhymnia's hand remained closed around the pale stone. Melpomene came forward from her position at the back and stood where she could see clearly. Hesiod, on the slope, looked down at them. There is a quality that the old accounts try to describe and do not quite succeed in capturing. The moment before the Muses breathe upon a mortal is not, the tellings insist, dramatic. It carries no thunder. No light descends. The air does not change temperature. What happens is subtler than any of these things, and for this reason it is more difficult to record. Hesiod later described it himself in the verses that would become the Theogony. He described meeting the Muses on Helicon, the goddesses breathing into him a divine voice. He described the staff of laurel they placed in his hands. He described their words, to sing the truth of things past and future. He described these things with the clarity of a man reporting what had actually happened to him, without embellishment, with the plain conviction of direct experience. What the verses do not capture, because verse cannot easily hold it, is the quality of the interval before. On the slope above the river shelf, Hesiod remained seated among his goats. One of the animals moved away from the group and was not corralled back. The others stood quiet. Calliope looked at the shepherd for a long, unhurried moment. The older tellings are consistent on this point, that she chose him, not because he was chosen for her, not because some divine assignment had directed her to this slope above this river on this particular afternoon. The Muses did not work by assignment. They moved as their nature moved, and their nature moved toward whatever in the mortal world was capable of receiving what they carried. Hesiod could receive what they carried. The goats were still. Calliope walked up the slope. She did not walk quickly. The grass was thin and the ground was dry, and her feet moved through both without disturbance. The other Muses did not follow her. They remained on the shelf below, arranged without arrangement, each occupying her own necessary distance from the event. Terpsichore's right wrist moved again. The same small rotation as before on the road, but resolved now, completed, the way a sentence completes itself after a long subordinate clause. Erato's humming stopped entirely. She held the silence with the same attention she gave to sound. Hesiod watched Calliope approach. The old accounts do not describe his expression. They record only that he did not stand, that he remained where he was among his goats on the dry grass of a Boeotian hillside, and that this stillness was itself a form of readiness. The stillness of someone who has been waiting for something without having words for what they waited for. Calliope stood before him. What happened next is described in the verses he would later write, and in the various traditions that grew from those verses, and in the commentaries on those traditions, which are patient and thorough and ultimately incomplete. She breathed upon him. The breath carried what it carried. It was not visible. It made no sound. But Hesiod, the goat-keeper of Askra, received it the way a dry hillside receives the first rain of autumn. Not with drama, but with the immediate and total reorganization that follows long thirst. From somewhere behind her, one of the sisters brought a staff of laurel. The accounts do not specify which of the 9 performed this small act. The laurel was cut and trimmed, its bark still pale where the knife had worked. Calliope took it and held it out to him. He took it with both hands. Then, because it was still afternoon on a dry Boeotian slope, and the goats still needed watching, she turned and walked back down to the shelf of open ground. And the Muses continued south on the road toward Helicon. Hesiod remained on the slope. Clio, walking at Calliope's right again, noted the encounter with the precision she gave to all things, the shepherd's name, if she knew it then, the location, the approximate hour measured by the angle of shadows. She did not speculate on what the breath had contained. That was not her method. She recorded what could be recorded. What the breath had given him would become available for recording in time. As the verses it produced entered the world and could be held and read and transcribed. Calliope said nothing. Her silence was unchanged from the silence she had held all afternoon. It had the same texture, the same interior weight. But there was, within it, something that had not been there before the crossing of the river, a slight shift in density. The way air changes in a room when a window is opened and then closed again. Brief, specific, gone before it could be named. Behind them, growing smaller on the hillside, the shepherd sat with a laurel staff across his knees and felt the first words forming in him. The way one feels a tide change in the dark, not by sight, but by the altered pressure of everything that surrounds you. Helicon was closer now. Its green was definite against the late sky. The road continued, pale and dusty, between low walls of fieldstone. Polyhymnia opened her hand and looked at the pale stone in her palm. She looked at it for several paces. Then she closed her hand again and kept walking. The shadows stretched eastward, long and without hurry, over the summer ground. The road south from the river crossing was quieter than the road before it, not because the landscape had changed. The same thin grass lined the verges. The same pale dust rose in small quantities beneath their feet and settled again. The low fieldstone walls continued their patient work of dividing one dry field from another. The quiet was of a different kind. It had accumulated the way warmth accumulates in stone over the course of a long day. The stone does not announce the warmth. It simply holds it. The Muses walked. It is recorded in more than one account that the southward road from the slopes of Askra carried the memory of the encounter for some time afterward, the encounter with the shepherd, the breath, the laurel staff held in two hands. These things settled into the afternoon without drama, and the afternoon continued, and the Muses moved through it as they had moved through all the hours before. But Calliope held. Within her silence, something she had held before on another road, in another season, a memory that did not surface as thought surfaces. More, the way a colour can be present in a stone without announcing itself, and yet the stone would be a different stone without it. The older traditions diverge on the specific nature of what the Muses remember. Some say they do not carry personal memory in the manner of mortals. Others say they carry all memory, which is a different condition entirely, not the accumulation of one life's experiences, but the vast and impersonal archive that their mother Mnemosyne had pressed into their bones before they were born. To remember everything is not the same as being consoled by memory. It is not the same as nostalgia, which requires forgetting in order to function. The Muses remembered without forgetting. Their knowledge of the past was not warm or soft. It was precise. And yet, Calliope's silence, which Clio noted and did not speculate upon, held within it a particular quality that distinguished it from her ordinary silence. Those who have studied the old accounts with care have noted that Calliope fell quiet in this way on at least one other occasion preserved in the telling, the wedding. The tale of the wedding of Peleus and Thetis comes to us through many hands, and each hand has left its mark. What remains consistent across the versions is the occasion itself, and the presence of the Muses, and the quality of the singing that day in the Golden Hall. It was said to be the last great gathering before the war, though no one present could have named it as such at the time. That is always the nature of last things. They do not announce themselves. They are recognized later in memory by the altered weight they carry. The hall was full. The gods came in their proper number and seated themselves at the long tables. Poseidon arrived smelling of open sea. Demeter came with a wreath of autumn grain she had not removed since the last harvest festival. Apollo was there, and he brought his lyre, and there was a moment early in the evening when the lyre rested against his shoulder untouched, and the hall was very quiet. And everyone present understood that the Muses would sing first. They stood together at the near end of the hall, all 9, arranged without visible arrangement, as they arranged themselves everywhere, each at her own necessary distance from the others. Calliope stood slightly apart, as she often stood. The accounts describe the opening passage of that evening's singing as a single sustained note held by all 9 voices simultaneously, not in unison. The note had different qualities in different voices. Euterpe's portion of it was clear and high, and would have resembled bird-song to mortal ears. Melpomene's portion carried a lower resonance, something that pressed against the chest from the inside. Erato wound through the centre of the cord with the quality of bronze warmed by fire, not burning, simply warm. Polyhymnia held her part of the note with stillness. She had always understood that the sacred does not perform itself. It inhabits the form that receives it, and the form must be held very quietly for the inhabiting to occur. Terpsichore did not sing the opening note. She moved through it instead, her hands describing the intervals between sounds, the way a map describes the intervals between places. The gods at the long tables did not speak during the singing. Some accounts say they did not move. Peleus and Thetis sat beside one another, and Thetis, who was sea-born and had known the voices of the deep, held her husband's hand and looked at no one in particular, as though the music had opened a space in the air before her that she could see through. This is where the accounts grow careful, because what they record of Calliope is specific, and the specific is always more difficult to hold than the general. Midway through the evening's singing, not at the beginning, not at the end, but in the middle of a long verse that described the lineage of Thetis, her ocean ancestry, the silver halls of Nereus, her father Calliope paused. Not a pause that interrupted the song. The others continued, and the music continued, and from the hall's perspective nothing had faltered. The pause was interior. A brief suspension in Calliope's voice, so slight it would have been imperceptible to anyone not paying close attention to her specifically. Clio was paying close attention. She was always paying close attention. Calliope's gaze, during those few measures, moved southward, or seemed to move southward, toward the wall of the hall beyond which lay the sea, beyond which, if one knew where to look, lay the coast of Asia and, further still, a city not yet burned. Troy. The tale does not record that Calliope saw anything. The accounts are careful on this point. They do not claim prophecy. They record only the pause and the direction of her gaze, and the fact that when her voice rejoined the others it carried, for a few measures, a different undertone, something lower. Something that did not belong entirely to a wedding song, but that was absorbed into it and was gone before it could be separately named. Melpomene, who understood that undertone by nature, did not look at Calliope. Thalia, who was singing a comic counterpoint somewhere in the upper register, did not hear it, or heard it and incorporated it, the way comedy incorporates the knowledge of its opposite. The wedding continued. The tables were filled. Wine was poured from vessels that did not empty. Peleus and Thetis received their guests with the ceremony that occasions of this order require, and the night stretched long and golden, and the Muses sang until the last of the stars had made their full arc. It is said that, in the morning, when the hall had quieted and the gods had departed, Calliope stood for some time at the edge of the terrace overlooking the sea. The sky was pale. The water was that particular grey-green that precedes full light. She held the pause from the night before in her chest like a note not yet released. What she already knew, in whatever way the daughters of Mnemosyne know things, not through foresight as mortals imagine it, but through the vast accumulated weight of everything already recorded, was that this gathering, this specific arrangement of gods and mortals in a golden hall above the sea, would not occur again in this form. There would be other gatherings. other occasions, other songs. But not this configuration, not these specific figures arranged in this specific hall before the war that was already present in the air like a sound too low to hear. She came back to the memory of it now on the road south, the afternoon stretching its shadows east, helicon green against the late sky. The memory surfaced not as grief, not as longing, as something without a name in the common tongue. The recognition that what is finished was also, in its time, complete. Euterpe, walking behind her, had begun to hum, very softly. The tune was nothing specific. It wound along the road the way a small stream winds, finding its own level, indifferent to destination. The hum moved through the afternoon and rested there, and the Muses walked, and the dust settled, and the shadows continued their long, lean eastward over the summer fields. Euterpe's hum continued for some time without resolving into anything recognizable. It passed through several intervals, paused, returned to an earlier note, and then simply stopped, the way a stream disappears into dry ground, not ending so much as ceasing. Ahead, the road bent westward around a low outcrop of pale stone. Beyond it, the afternoon opened again into flat fields and the thin, grey-green line of a distant olive grove. Clio walked near the middle of the group. She had not spoken since the river crossing. Her attention, as it tended to be, was distributed widely, across the road, the fieldstone walls, the particular quality of light in this hour. She noticed things without cataloguing them aloud. This was her nature. What she observed, she held. She did not offer it back until the moment of offering was correct. She had not stopped noticing Calliope, not with worry. Worry was a mortal habit, and Clio had little use for it. What she felt was closer to attentiveness. The kind of attentiveness given to an object whose significance has not yet become fully visible. A shard of pottery that might be ordinary, or might be the rim of something much older. The patience to wait and see. Calliope walked slightly ahead and slightly apart. Her sandals raised the same pale dust as the others. Her hands were at her sides. Nothing about her posture announced what she was carrying. Nothing about her posture needed to. Clio had been at the wedding. She remembered, not in the way mortals remember, with edges worn soft and details trading places, but in full, without any loss. She remembered the pause, the 4 measures during the lineage of Thetis. The way Calliope's gaze had moved. She remembered Melpomene's stillness beside her, that particular quality of someone who has understood something and chosen not to respond. She remembered, too, the morning after, Calliope at the terrace railing, the grey-green water, the held note. What the records do not easily carry is what passed between them in that morning light. The accounts tend to focus on what can be stated plainly. They mention Calliope's position at the terrace. They mention the direction of the sky. They do not record what Clio said to her, or whether Clio said anything at all. The accounts are incomplete at this point, perhaps because what occurred between them did not resolve into language, perhaps because language was not the instrument required. The tale tells it this way. Clio walked up beside Calliope that morning and stood with her, not speaking, not asking. She stood at the same railing, looking at the same water, and after a time she placed her hand over Calliope's hand on the stone. It was not a gesture of comfort. It was a gesture of presence. The difference matters. Comfort implies that something has gone wrong and requires amendment. Presence implies only that 2 figures stand at the same railing, looking at the same water, and that this is sufficient. They stood there until the light had changed from grey-green to the first pale gold. Then Calliope took her hand away from the railing and turned from the sea. That is all the accounts preserve. But those who know the daughters of Mnemosyne well, the scholars who have spent lifetimes reading the traces they leave in verse and stone, tend to agree that this is the shape of how those 2 sisters have always understood one another, not through declaration. through proximity, through the willingness to stand at the same railing without requiring the standing to be explained. On the road south, Clio now let the distance between herself and Calliope close by a few steps, not all the way. She did not walk alongside her. She simply allowed the gap to narrow, the way a river narrows in its upper reaches, pulling its banks in without rushing. Calliope did not turn, but she slowed almost imperceptibly so that the narrowing continued. Behind them, the others walked in their own arrangements. Urania had found a smooth stone beside the road and was turning it in her fingers, a habit of hers when calculating the arc of something. Melpomene and Thalia had drifted to either side of the road, as they sometimes did, walking parallel rather than together, close enough that words might pass between them if words were wanted. Erato had fallen into step beside Polyhymnia. Polyhymnia was not speaking. Erato was describing something in a low voice, not a story, not a poem, something between the two. Polyhymnia listened with her head tilted very slightly. This was her version of acknowledgement. It was enough. Terpsichore walked near the rear, just ahead of Euterpe. She had stopped humming. Her steps had taken on a slight pattern, an almost imperceptible rhythm that had nothing to do with the pace of travel and everything to do with some interior count she was keeping. Her feet found the cadence of it without breaking stride. These arrangements shifted and resettled as the road went on. The 9 moved not as a formation but as a field, each element within it finding its own position relative to the others, adjusting when the road required it, drifting when the fields opened wide. This was how the accounts described the daughters of Mnemosyne in motion, not marching, not scattered, something between order and wandering that has no exact name in the common tongue. What the chapter of that afternoon preserves most clearly is not any single moment but a texture. The way the Muses moved through the landscape, which had not asked them to pass through it, and did not arrange itself for their benefit. The pale road, the fieldstone walls, the dry grass making its small sound when the wind moved across it, the 9 figures crossing through all of it unhurried, each carrying her own interior weight, each in proximity to the others. And at some point in the descent toward the olive grove, Calliope spoke. Not loudly, just the ordinary level at which one speaks to someone walking nearby. She said, "Of that morning at the terrace, I heard you come up beside me." Clio said nothing for a moment. "Then I know. That was the extent of it." 2 statements that touched and did not elaborate. The kind of exchange that requires a great deal of shared history to be sufficient, and which was, between these two, entirely sufficient. The road continued. The olive grove came closer. Somewhere in its shade the air would be cooler. The dust on the road ahead had already begun to darken, touched by the shadow of the first trees. The 9 Muses walked into that shade in their loose arrangement. The green of Helicon still visible behind them against the late sky, the valley ahead holding the remainder of the afternoon in its flat and quiet hands. The olive grove received them without ceremony. The trees stood at irregular intervals, some ancient enough that their trunks had spiraled into themselves. Bark grey, silver in the late light, branches spreading in patterns that suggested long consultation with the wind. The ground beneath was softer than the road. Dry grass gave way to something quieter, a sparse covering of low growth, pale and fine, that made almost no sound underfoot. The 9 moved into the shade, and the arrangement of them shifted as it always did when the landscape changed around them. Calliope passed between 2 of the oldest trees and continued a short way before stopping. Not at anything in particular. She stopped where the light came through the canopy in slow, overlapping shapes. And she stood there with her hands at her sides. Clio came through after her and found a tree whose roots had lifted slightly from the ground and sat at the base of it. Not far from Calliope, close enough that the silence between them was shared rather than separate. The others dispersed through the grove as the grove permitted. Urania found a low clearing where the canopy opened and the early evening sky showed through, pale still, not yet committed to dusk. She sat with the stone she had been carrying all afternoon and turned it in her fingers, her gaze moving between the stone and the sky above with the small alternations of someone who is checking one record against another. Melpomene and Thalia came through the trees from different directions and arrived in the same general area at roughly the same time. They did not appear to have planned this. Melpomene settled against one trunk, Thalia against another nearby, and they existed in their familiar parallel without requiring it to be acknowledged. Euterpe sat down with her back to a gnarled root and looked at her hands for a time. She had not hummed since morning. The quiet around her was not empty. It was the quiet of someone carrying a sound internally, turning it over without releasing it. There would be a time to release it. That time was not yet. Polyhymnia walked some distance further into the grove, past the oldest trees, to where the ground dipped slightly and the shade was deepest. She stood there without sitting. Her posture was the posture of someone listening. The accounts that mention Polyhymnia at rest almost always note this, that even her stillness has the quality of attention, as though the sacred hymns she carries exist for her not as memory but as ongoing reception, something she is always in the process of hearing. Erato and Terpsichore had paused near one another at the edge of the grove, where the field they had crossed was still visible through the trees. Erato was looking back at the road. Terpsichore's foot had settled, the interior rhythm she had been keeping through the afternoon finally come to rest. She stood flat and quiet on the soft ground. The rhythm dissolved into stillness, the way a wave dissolves when it reaches land. For a time none of them spoke. This was not unusual. The daughters of Mnemosyne have always been comfortable with silence of this kind, the silence that comes after long movement. When the body has been occupied with traversing a landscape and can at last set that occupation down, there is a particular quality to how they inhabit such silences, present without demanding that the silence resolve into anything. They had inherited from their mother an understanding that memory does not always need to be spoken to be kept. The light in the grove shifted as the sun continued its descent. What had been pale gold filtered through leaves became something older, a slower, more amber quality, the kind of light that falls in autumn even in summer. That makes objects cast long, soft shadows pointing east. Calliope had not moved from where she stood. Then, after a time, she spoke. Not to Clio specifically, to the grove perhaps, or to the air, or to no one. But Clio heard, and the others, scattered through the trees, heard too in the way that one hears a voice that is not directed at oneself. She said, there will be 17 days of it. No one asked what she meant. They knew. The accounts preserved from this moment suggest that the knowledge had been with them all since the road south began, since Helicon receded behind them. Since the dust on the path began to carry the faint salt the air takes on when the sea is ahead. They were not walking toward the olive grove as a destination. They were walking toward the shore. And beyond the shore, across an intervening age that the Muses held in a way mortals cannot, lay Troy. Lay the body of a fallen hero. Lay the 17 days of mourning that the oldest accounts record, Thetis and the Nereids coming up from the sea, and the 9 daughters of Zeus and Mnemosyne giving voice to grief so complete it became something else. Something that outlasted the grief itself. The lament for Achilles. Calliope knew what it required of her. She had known since the wedding at which she paused mid-verse. Since her gaze moved south without her instruction and remained there for 4 measures while the others continued, she had been carrying it since then, the weight of the elegy she would lead. The dirge she would lift until the air above Troy grew quiet with it. Song as the vessel that holds what cannot otherwise be held. This was the oldest understanding the Muses carried, older than the 9, older than Helicon, older even than the spring. Pegasus struck open from the rock. Melete, Mime, and Aide had known it in the age before that practice and memory and song are not separate instruments but one thing seen from three angles, that the elegy for Achilles existed before Achilles was born, that Calliope's voice had always been the place it would be kept. She lifted her hand and rested it against the bark of the nearest olive tree. The tree was old. Its bark had the texture of something that had listened to a great deal and kept all of it. Her fingers traced the ridges of it without purpose, the way a person runs a hand along a surface when the hands need occupation while the mind is occupied elsewhere. Clio watched from her place at the root of the other tree. She did not speak. She turned her gaze from Calliope to the canopy above, where the amber light was beginning to settle towards something cooler and less certain. She was noting the moment as she always noted moments. Not to interrupt it, to hold it in the particular care with which history holds things, not to change them, but to ensure they are not lost. Urania lowered the stone she had been turning. It had told her what she needed. Or she had found in it what she was looking for. She set it down on the ground beside her with the small precision of someone placing something in its final location. Then she looked up at the strip of sky above the clearing, where the first star of evening had appeared, very faint, barely a mark against the pale blue. She did not name it aloud. She simply looked at it the way one acknowledges what has been expected. In the deepest part of the grove, Polyhymnia's hands moved, very slightly, the way hands move when a phrase arrives that one has been waiting for. She would not sing it here. She would carry it forward, past the road, past the shore, past the 17 days of lamentation, and into the hymns that would survive long after the war itself was dust and argument. The grove held all of them in its slow, silver-grey shade. The fieldstone walls of the valley were visible through the outer trees, and beyond them the flat land continued south. Helicon had disappeared from view behind the ridge. There was only the grove, the amber light descending, and the 9 daughters of Mnemosyne at rest in their loose and settled arrangement. Calliope left her hand on the bark of the olive tree a moment longer, then she lowered it. She turned to look at Clio. Clio met the look. No words passed. Nothing was required to pass. The morning's gesture at the railing, hand over hand, grey-green water, light shifting to pale gold, had already said what needed to be said between them. What passed now was only confirmation. The acknowledgement that they were both present in this same hour, this same grove, this same slow amber light, and that what lay ahead would be carried, as everything was carried by the daughters of memory, together. The stone Urania had set down rested against the root of a tree, half in shadow, half in the last of the golden light. Its surface still held the warmth of her fingers. The chapter plan names this chapter the Castalian Spring and Parnassus. What the grove holds now, in its amber-lit silence, is one thing. What the accounts preserve alongside it is another. The oldest tellings move freely between the two, between the scene of departure and the larger world that gave the Muses their second dwelling. So the record turns here, as records sometimes must, and holds both. There was another mountain. Not Helicon, with its wild slopes and its spring struck open by the hoof of a winged horse. Not Pieria in the north, where Zeus and Mnemosyne lay together across 9 long nights, and the daughters of inspiration first began their slow approach toward form. The second mountain was Parnassus. And Parnassus had a different quality entirely. Its twin peaks rose above the Gulf of Corinth to the south, visible on clear days from a remarkable distance. The summit carried snow late into spring. Below the peaks, on a wide ledge of mountain where the rock gave way to something softer, sat a grove and a spring. And not far below them, among the stones and terraces of a deeper descent, the sanctuary of Delphi and the oracle who spoke in riddles that took years to understand. The Muses knew Parnassus as well as they knew Helicon, perhaps differently. Helicon was theirs in the way a home is owned, by long habitation, by the particular light of particular mornings, known only to those who had been present for them. Parnassus was theirs in another way, through their bond with Apollo, through the arrangement that the earliest accounts name with a single phrase the god who was also their leader, Musagetes, leader of the Muses. Apollo came to Parnassus as he came to all his sacred sites, not with ceremony, but with the ease of belonging. He carried the lyre. He carried also that particular stillness that describes him better than any catalogue of attributes, the stillness of one who has heard enough music to no longer need to listen outwardly. He listened inwardly. He moved through the world with his ear already tuned to what the world concealed within itself. The Muses came to Parnassus and found him already there, or nearly always already there. It was not a relationship of instruction. What passed between Apollo and the 9 daughters of Mnemosyne was not the relationship of teacher to student, nor of deity to lesser power. It was, the accounts suggest, the recognition of kindred purpose. He held melody, they held voice. The two were not the same thing, and they were not interchangeable, and the difference between them was the very space in which music becomes complete. They sang on Parnassus as they sang on Helicon. But the songs had a different character. Helicon's music moved through wild pine and open meadow. Parnassus held its sounds differently. The rock face caught them and gave them back changed. Layers accumulated in the stone. An echo on Parnassus arrived after the original sound, with an interval just long enough to suggest it had been considered. The Castalian spring rose from a cleft in the rock between the 2 peaks. Its water was cold. Cold in the particular way of mountain water, not merely low in temperature, but clean, in a way that went past temperature into something almost structural. It moved out of the rock and down through a narrow channel, cut partly by nature and partly by the hands of those who had tended the site across many generations. Pilgrims came to drink from it before ascending to the oracle. Poets came to drink from it before attempting lines they did not know how to begin. Priests who served the sanctuary below cupped their hands in it each morning as part of their preparation. The tradition preserved in the oldest sources states this clearly. The waters of Castalia carried the Muses' gift to those who drank with the right intention, not to every hand that cupped the water. Intention mattered. The gift was not a property of the spring itself, but a property of the Muses' presence in it, their breath, their long habitation of the site, the residue of every song they had sung on the slope above, which had descended in the only way sound ever truly descends, not through air but through stone, through the long slow passage of vibration into rock, and rock into water, and water into the hands of whoever came seeking. One version of the tradition holds that a poet who drank from Castalia received not words but the condition that makes words possible, a brief opening, a moment of access to what had always been present but undetectable. The Muses did not fill the poet with their voices. They cleared a passage. What moved through that passage was already there, waiting in the place where the poet's own memory intersected with the vast memory their mother Mnemosyne carried. Mnemosyne, who held within herself everything that had ever occurred. Her daughters, through the spring, offered the briefest alignment between individual recollection and that larger archive. This is what the accounts call inspiration, not the descent of something foreign, the recognition of something interior that had been unreachable. Those who climbed to Parnassus without understanding this returned home unchanged. Those who climbed knowing what they sought, who stood at the spring with their hands already shaped by the lines they were reaching for, sometimes left with the precise word that had been missing. The spring did not supply the poem. It supplied the last necessary interval, the gap bridged. Apollo understood this more completely than any other figure in the accounts. He sat with the Muses on the slope above Castalia and played while they arranged and rearranged the hymns being composed for the gods' feasts on Olympus. His lyre provided the frame. Their voices provided the meaning. The frame and the meaning were not separable in performance, but in their origins they remained distinct, and the distinction mattered to both parties. It was honoured. Each deferred to the other's essential contribution. The Muses did not ask Apollo to be other than he was. He did not ask them to be other than they were. The music that resulted was complete in a way that neither could achieve separately. Parnassus also held something Helicon did not: the nearness of prophecy. The oracle at Delphi below spoke in Apollo's name. What she spoke was not always what Apollo intended, or perhaps it was always exactly what he intended, and the difficulty lay in what mortals made of it. The boundary between poetry and prophecy was, on Parnassus, difficult to locate. Both required the same condition, a quieted mind, a willingness to receive what arrived without immediately attempting to manage it. The Muses understood this. Their art had always demanded it. What the oracle practiced below in the aditon of the temple was not so different in its requirements from what Calliope practiced above at the spring. A pillar of smoke rose from the sanctuary below on days when the oracle spoke. The Muses, seated on the slope, watched it ascend. They noted its movement. They did not interpret it. They let it rise and thin and disappear into the mountain air above them, which was already full of the things they had been singing. The spring ran through all seasons. In deep winter, when the peaks were white and the sanctuary below stood quiet, the Castalian water still moved through its channel, slower then, thicker with cold, but continuous. The Muses did not cease to be present simply because mortals ceased to climb. The spring held their gift, whether or not anyone came to receive it. This was also part of what the oldest accounts preserve. The spring was patient. The gift was patient. It had been deposited there over a long succession of visits, and would remain available over a long succession of years, offered to anyone who came with an honest hand and the specific kind of silence that means readiness rather than emptiness. In the olive grove to the south, where 9 daughters of memory rested in the amber descent of an afternoon, the air carried the faint salt that meant the sea was ahead. Behind them, Helicon. Beside them, invisibly, Parnassus and its spring. Within them, as it had been since Pieria, the whole long archive of everything they had been given to keep. Euterpe shifted her position against the gnarled root. Just slightly. Her back found a different angle in the bark. The sound she had been holding internally since morning did not change. It had not needed to change. It was patient in the way of springs. The amber light in the canopy moved by one slow degree toward something cooler. The first star of evening, still faint, remained in its gap of pale sky. The light in the olive grove had nearly finished its slow shift from amber to something without a clear name. Not gold, not grey. The hour between. Calliope had not moved from where she sat. Her back rested against a trunk older than any record, its bark split in long vertical lines, its roots half exposed by the slope. The others were near. Polyhymnia had her eyes open, but her attention directed inward. Thalia had stopped laughing some time ago, not from sadness, but from satisfaction. The day had reached the point where laughter was no longer necessary. It held the good quiet that follows it. There was a matter the accounts address here. They address it briefly, as though even the oldest chroniclers understood that what Calliope carried in that grove did not require elaboration to be significant. It required only the still air and someone willing to listen to the shape of the silence. Some time before, word had come from Olympus. The tale tells it differently in different versions. Some say Zeus sent a messenger. Some say Hermes arrived before dawn, settling on a branch at the grove's edge and announcing the matter without preamble. Others preserve a tradition in which Calliope simply knew, in the way that the oldest accounts allow their figures to simply know certain things, the knowledge arriving not through hearing, but through a quality of attention that had nothing to do with ears. What the accounts agree upon is this: the dispute between Aphrodite and Persephone had grown beyond what the gods wished to resolve themselves. Adonis was at the centre of it. A mortal of extraordinary beauty, born from circumstances that were themselves already complicated, both goddesses had claim to him. Aphrodite had loved him first in her manner, which was total and possessive. Persephone had received him in her realm and loved him in her manner, which was quieter and just as total, and just as possessive. Neither would yield. Zeus, who had heard arguments between goddesses before, understood that to judge this himself would be to declare one goddess superior to the other. He was not willing to do that. Not in this matter, not with these two. So he called upon Calliope. The accounts are careful here. They do not describe this as a surprising choice. They record it in the tone of something expected. Calliope was the eldest of the 9. Her domain was epic poetry, the long form, the kind of narration that required holding multiple truths in balance for the full length of a telling, without letting any one of them collapse the others. She had done this in verse for longer than most gods had held their offices. To hold competing truths and find their proportion, this was her function. The gods recognized it. She heard the matter fully. Aphrodite's case was impassioned, shaped by the particular fire of desire that the goddess carried in her person. Even in argument she was luminous. Her words did not ask for consideration. They reached for it, the way her own myths had always functioned, immediate, overwhelming, operating on the listener before the listener had decided how to respond. Persephone spoke differently. Hers was a quieter authority. She had governed a realm that required patience, and the quality of her speech reflected this. She was precise. She named what she had given and what she had received. She did not embellish. Calliope listened to both without interrupting either. The nymphs who served as witnesses said later that she had kept her eyes lowered for most of both arguments. Not from inattention, from the opposite. She was listening with more than her ears. She was listening with the faculty she had practiced since Pieria, the deep attending that finds what the words are carrying beneath the words themselves. When both goddesses finished, the grove was very quiet. Calliope considered. The accounts vary on how long this took. Some sources give it the length of 3 breaths. Others suggest the sun moved a full degree before she spoke. The older accounts simply note the interval without measuring it. The measurement was not the point. She spoke her judgment plainly. Adonis would be divided across the year into 3 portions. 1/3 of the year he would spend with Aphrodite, 1/3 with Persephone. The remaining 1/3 belonged to Adonis himself, to spend according to his own choosing. The structure of this was important, and the accounts that have preserved it note the structure carefully. Calliope did not give 2 goddesses equal time by splitting the year in half. She introduced a 3rd portion, Adonis's own. This was not compromise in the ordinary sense of the word. It was something more considered. It acknowledged that the subject of the dispute was not an object to be divided, but a being with a portion of the year that was his own sovereign territory. Neither goddess was given precedence over the other, and Adonis was not simply allocated. He was recognized. The 2 goddesses accepted the judgment. This itself the accounts find worth noting. Aphrodite, who had not been known for accepting the judgments of others gracefully, accepted this one. Persephone, who governed a realm by her own authority and was not accustomed to third-party determinations, accepted it as well. The accounts attribute this not to the specific proportions of the ruling, but to the quality of how it was delivered. Something in the way Calliope had spoken made the decision feel less like an imposition and more like a naming of what had always been the natural arrangement. Waiting for someone with sufficient patience to see it clearly. What the oldest accounts note alongside this is a small detail. After the judgment was given, Calliope did not linger in the formal setting where the arbitration had taken place. She returned to the slopes, to the mountain, to the work that continued before and after the specific moments that found her name in the records. The tradition holds that she sat for a long time with the structure of the judgment in her mind, not reconsidering it, examining its weight, finding in it the same quality she had always found in the lines that resolved themselves correctly, the satisfaction of a thing in its proper proportion, placed where it had always needed to be. In the olive grove, the amber light had become the cooler light entirely. The first star of evening had grown certain of itself. A second had appeared beside it. Euterpe had not moved from her root. The sound she held within her had begun, at some point in the late afternoon, to move outward, not as performance, as exhale. A slow, sustained note that the other 8 received without turning toward it. It needed no acknowledgement. It filled the space the way warmth fills a room that has been closed and open to the sun. Calliope, across the root ground from Euterpe, heard it. She let it pass through her attention the way the Castalian water passed through its channel, not grasped, simply received. The salt in the air had strengthened. The sea was there, ahead in the darkening south, holding its own long note beneath the evening. The stones of the grove, warmed through the afternoon, held their temperature a little longer than the air around them. This was their final contribution to the day. The warmth they gave back slowly, without drama, having kept it all the hours of light. The 9 daughters of Mnemosyne rested in the keeping of that warmth. The judgment had been made. The spring ran on Parnassus, patient, continuous. Hesiod's words were already fixed in the throat of the tradition. Orpheus was somewhere in Thrace with his lyre and his voice, and the gift Calliope had passed into mortal flesh. The dirge at Troy was behind them. The magpies were chattering in some northern wood, still unable to understand why their boasting had been answered with feathers and silence. All of it was held now, sorted into its proper proportion, given its share of the year. Calliope watched the second star become definite beside the first. Her hand rested open on the root beside her, palm facing upward. An old olive leaf, dry and curled from its time on the ground, lay across the centre of her palm where the wind had placed it in the late afternoon, and she had not disturbed it since. Polyhymnia had not spoken since the afternoon. This was not unusual. Of the 9, she was the one who spent the most time inside the space before words, the interval that precedes the naming of the sacred. The accounts that mention her tend to note her silences more than her utterances. They describe a stillness of a particular quality, not absence. Presence held inward, the way a deep vessel holds water without showing its surface. She sat now with her back against one of the older olives, a few trunks distant from Calliope. Her eyes were open. They had been open for some time. She looked, as far as the accounts can determine, at nothing in particular, or rather at the general fabric of the darkening air, as one who is attending not to any single thing but to the whole of what was there. The third star of evening had appeared by now, small, tentative at first, then firmer. Polyhymnia noted it without gesture. Her domain was the hymn, and the hymn was a careful thing, more careful than the epic, which could carry its meaning in momentum, more careful than lyric, which could trust the feeling to do half the work. The hymn had to approach the sacred directly. It had to name what could not, strictly speaking, be named. It had to hold a god's nature in a phrase without reducing it, without stretching it falsely, without arriving too quickly at reverence or lingering too long on praise. This was a narrow path. Polyhymnia had spent what amounted to an eternity learning how narrow it was. She thought, sitting there in the olive grove, of the hymns not yet made. There were always more of them than the made ones. This was one of the facts of her condition. A muse does not exhaust her domain. The hymns existing in the world were a small portion of what waited in the unmade. There were hymns for the smaller gods, for Hecate's triple face at the crossroads, for Hephaestus working in the deep fire silence of his forge, for Iris crossing from one order of being to another on a bridge of colour. These hymns existed in the way seeds exist before the ground receives them. Present, patient, waiting on the right conditions. Polyhymnia turned her open palm toward the sky, then let it rest again in her lap. She was thinking. The tradition notes about what it meant to hold the sacred in voice. The question had occupied her for longer than she could precisely account for. It was not a question that resolved. It was a question that deepened as she returned to it. The way a well does not appear different from above, but draws up different water depending on how long the rope descends. To speak a god's name in a hymn was not simply to identify them, it was to recognize them. To recognize was different from describing. Description catalogued what was visible. Recognition acknowledged what was beneath the visible, what was prior to form. A good hymn did not say, "This is what Demeter is." It said here, in this approach, in this careful gathering of syllables, is what Demeter means. The distinction mattered to Polyhymnia more than most distinctions. She had heard hymns that described. They were useful in their way. They gathered information, arranged it, presented it to the listener in orderly sequence, but they left the god at a distance. The listener finished them knowing more about the deity and no closer to the deity's presence. A true hymn should change the air in the room where it was sung. The god should become briefly perceptible, the way the sea becomes perceptible not only when you can see it, but when you first smell the salt before the water is visible. The salt in the air had continued to strengthen. The sea, still unseen behind the slope, was making itself known in exactly that way. Polyhymnia noticed this. She did not find it remarkable. It was simply the sea doing what the sea does, offering itself to attention, whether or not attention was being paid. This struck her as having something in common with the sacred itself. The presence did not depend on recognition. Recognition was what the hymn was for. The presence preceded it. Euterpe's note had shifted at some point in the settling of the evening. Not louder, differently shaped. The way a river changes its sound as the light changes without altering its course. The note had moved imperceptibly towards something that was not quite a melody but was adjacent to one. The other 7 received it in their separate postures and did not name it. Melpomene sat a little apart, her hands clasped together on her knees. She had not spoken since before the judgment was delivered. Tragedy, which was her inheritance, taught a kind of patience with what could not be altered. She understood the sitting with. The accounts say she looked out toward the dark south, toward the sea, and that her expression held something that was not grief exactly, but was adjacent to grief. The recognizing of weight. Terpsichore had drawn her feet up close under her on the route she occupied. Her toes were still. She had danced at the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, and she had stood still on the shore at Troy. And the distance between those 2 occasions was measurable in years, but not adequately measured by years. She sat with that distance now, without naming it. Urania had turned her face fully upward. She was counting what was visible. 4 stars now, 5. The lesser constellations assembling themselves in the lower dark. She knew each by its proper position and by the pattern it described with its neighbours. The patterns had names, and the names had histories, and the histories were the kind of record that did not require a stylus to preserve. The sky wrote its own archive and rewrote it each night in the same hand. Clio had arranged a few small stones near her route during the afternoon, 3 of them. She had not moved them since. They sat in a loose arrangement that was not quite a line. The accounts do not explain her intention. Perhaps there was none that could be stated. She was the keeper of what had occurred, and occasionally this expressed itself in small arrangements of what was present, as though the immediate world deserved the same attentiveness as the distant past. Erato had grown very still. Her domain was the love poem, and the love poem required, beneath its apparent warmth, a precise attention to the inner state. She sat with her own inner state now, cataloguing it without judgment. The grove. The cooling. The salt. The stars acquiring themselves overhead one by one. She found in this assembly of ordinary things a quality she could have made a poem from, though she did not reach for it. The material was there. The reaching was not required tonight. Thalia, who had been quietly satisfied for the better part of the afternoon, remained so. Comedy understood satisfaction. It understood the moment when things arrived at their natural proportion, and the response was not laughter, but its quieter cousin, a settling. She had settled. She occupied her portion of the evening without wanting it to be otherwise. And Polyhymnia sat with the hymns not yet composed, in the company of her 8 sisters, and the 3rd and 4th and 5th stars of evening, and the warmth the gravestones were slowly giving back to the air. She thought about Hippocrene on Helicon, the spring that the hoof of Pegasus had opened in the rock. She had sat beside it at night before many times. The water ran cold out of the earth, and tasted of the stone it had passed through. Those who drank from it were said to receive the capacity for inspired speech. The accounts debated what this meant, whether the water carried something, or whether it simply opened what was already carried. Polyhymnia had her own understanding of this, which she had not written down because she did not write things down. It lived in her the way the hymns live, waiting for the right occasion, which might or might not arrive. The occasion was not tonight. Tonight was for the sitting, for the warmth in the stones, for the note Euterpe held somewhere in the middle distance of the evening air, for Calliope's open palm and the dry leaf the wind had placed there, and no wind had yet seen fit to take away. Polyhymnia closed her eyes at last. Behind them, the hymns she had not yet made continued their patient arrangement, hymns for gods whose names she knew, and gods whose names were still resolving out of the old dark. The sacred had more names than any one age could hold. She trusted this. She had always trusted this. The 5th star became a 6th. The grove grew darker by degrees, each degree small enough to be unnoticeable until several had accumulated. The sea held its note. The 6th star held its place. Urania, whose attention had been on the sky for the better part of the evening, did not need to count it again. 6 was a sufficient number for the purposes of the night. She let her gaze rest rather than search, and the sky received this without comment. The constellations continued their slow arrangement, each star indifferent to being named, and no less present for having a name. She thought of the 3 Muses who had come before the 9. Melete, Meme, and Aoide, practice, memory, and song. Their names were older than Helicon's spring, older than Pegasus's hoof striking the rock. They had existed in that earlier quiet, before the 9 were counted and given their separate offices, and their names contained within them the whole structure of what the 9 now carried divided. Practice was the body of the thing, memory was its reason. Song was what it became when the other 2 were present together. Urania understood this as she understood the constellations. Separation was a kind of clarity. It allowed the individual nature of each thing to be seen. The olive grove did not ask them to be other than what they were tonight. Calliope's palm remained open. The dry leaf had not moved. It lay across her fingers, a small brown thing, its veins still visible in the last of the sky's warmth. The accounts say that Calliope, who had given Orpheus his gift, and had sat in judgment between goddesses, and had opened the first line of the first great epic in the silence of her mind, held the leaf with the same quality of attention. No object was too small to be attended to. This was what the muse of epic poetry knew, that was not always written into her office. The large required practice on the small. The vast required apprenticeship in the near at hand. Melpomene had not shifted her gaze from the dark south. The sea was not visible from the grove, but its sound came up the slope, low and continuous, underneath Euterpe's note. The 2 sounds did not conflict. They occupied different registers, and the ear could hold both, and Melpomene did hold both without doing anything with them. Tragedy was not only the shape of falling, it was also the afterward. The sitting in the place where the falling had occurred, when the action was complete and the stage was quiet, and what remained was the specific silence that follows the final word. She knew this silence well. It had weight, but the weight was not shapeless. It had a specific form, the form of whatever had preceded it, and this gave it a quality that bore sitting with rather than fleeing. She sat with it. Terpsichore's toes remain still on the root. The accounts, in their various forms, agree on this small detail without explaining why they preserved it. Perhaps because stillness in Terpsichore was the kind of thing that invited noticing. She was the muse of the moving body, the impulse that turned feeling into step, weight into arc. Her stillness was not the absence of that impulse, but its patient interior form. She had felt the impulse once at the wedding of Peleus and Thetis. She had felt it at Troy in the opposite direction, an impulse to remain absolutely fixed while the shore held what the shore was holding. Both had been true to her nature. Both had expressed the same underlying attentiveness in different directions. Tonight expressed it too. Clio's 3 stones had not moved since the afternoon, and they would not move. The grove floor held them in the loose arrangement she had made, and the arrangement was neither significant nor insignificant. It was the arrangement that existed. She had made it, and then ceased attending to it, which was a kind of trust. The records she kept were permanent in a different sense than stones, but stones were also a kind of record, and she did not sort these categories too firmly. The cooling continued its slow work on the air. The salt strengthened slightly, as it did on these hillside evenings when the warmth that had risen from the land all day began to relent, and the sea's presence moved up the slope to fill the space left behind. Erato breathed it in. She had been cataloguing quietly, without stylus or tablet, the precise combination of elements that constituted the grove at this hour. The olive bark, the stone warmth now diminishing but still present in the roots nearest the ground, the overhead dark, which was not yet full dark, but was no longer the pale dark of early dusk, the sound of 8 other forms of breathing, each slightly different. She knew all 8 by their quality. She would not have needed to look to name the breather. This too was a kind of love poem, the kind that required no address, no figure across a threshold, no name spoken upward to a window. Only precise attention to what was gathered, and the willingness to find it sufficient. She found it sufficient. Thalia, for her part, had closed her eyes some time ago. Not as Polyhymnia had closed hers, in the sustained attention of the interior, but in the easy closure of one who has arrived and has nothing further required of arriving. Comedy was also this. The recognition that the scene had reached its natural form, that to extend it would be to spoil the proportion, and that the correct response to proportion was to inhabit it without embellishment. She inhabited it. Euterpe's note had been continuous for longer than any of them had specifically tracked. At some point in the late afternoon it had ceased being a distinct action and had become a condition of the grove. Like the salt or the warmth in the stones, it was present without effort. The accounts suggest that Euterpe herself was unaware of when the note had made this transition, or that her awareness of it was of a different kind than the awareness one brought to a decision. It was the note the evening required, and she was giving it, and the giving had become as natural as the air that carried it. Polyhymnia. Behind her closed eyes sat with the full weight of the gathered silence that was not silence. She could hear Euterpe's note. She could hear the sea's low insistence beneath it. She could hear the individual breathings of her sisters, each at its own pace and depth, composing together something that had no formal name but could be recognized. She knew the sound of her sisters at rest. It was a sound she had known from the beginning, from Pieria, from the slopes where they had been born in quick succession, and Mnemosyne had held all 9, and the sound of that holding had contained this sound, as a seed contains what it will eventually become. The hymns behind her closed eyes continued their patient arrangement, not urgent, not fading, simply present in the manner of things that have always been present and will wait as long as waiting is required. The 7th star appeared. Urania noted its arrival without counting aloud. She knew which star it was by its position relative to those already present, and she knew the name its position gave it in the records she kept without keeping. and she let the name rest in the place where names rested when they were not being spoken. The grove received the seventh star as it had received the others. The dark deepened by another degree. Calliope's dry leaf lay across her open palm, and the evening moved around it, and the leaf did not move. Calliope's palm remained open. The leaf rested there in the way that things rest when they have been held long enough that holding and being held become indistinguishable. Mnemosyne, who had sat without speaking through the long descent of the afternoon into evening, shifted her weight slightly against the olive trunk behind her. The bark pressed its pattern into her shoulder. She did not adjust away from it. Tragedy understood the value of the mark left by contact. The impression of bark on skin was a small record, the kind Cleo would have recognized. The kind that required no stylus. What the grove held in this hour was the full account of what 9 daughters of Zeus and Mnemosyne had given to the world of mortals. Not as a list, not as a recitation. The giving was present in the air of the grove, the way the salt was present. You could not point to it. But you would notice immediately if it were removed. Consider what had been left behind. A shepherd on a mountain slope in Boeotia had woken one morning with a voice not entirely his own. Hesiod, who had carried his flock through seasons of ordinary silence, had risen from his rest to find the Theogony already forming in his breath. The Muses had breathed upon him. Not metaphorically. The accounts do not soften this. They breathed upon a shepherd, and the shepherd opened his mouth, and the first coherent account of how the world had come to be came out of him in verse. He had been an ordinary man. That had been the point. The voice of Hesiod was still moving through the world. It had been moving for a very long time. Every hand that had copied the Theogony onto a new surface had carried that breath forward, thinned by repetition, but not extinguished. Somewhere to the north. Across the water and through the flat lands of Thrace, a man named Thamyris had once sung with a certainty that approached the divine. His voice had stopped travellers on roads. Kings had wept at his performances. He had understood his gift precisely well enough to love it, and not well enough to know its origin. What the Muses had taken from him they had not taken carelessly. The silence they left behind was instructive, and the world had found it instructive. And the story of Thamyris had been repeated at the feet of every young singer who felt certainty hardening into something less permeable than it ought to be. The lesson was still arriving. In a field in Macedonia, 9 women with loud voices and confident expressions had transformed into 9 birds who still chattered without saying anything. The Pierides had wanted a contest. They had received one. What they had not understood, standing before the daughters of memory and the Lord of Heaven, was that the Muses did not sing to compete. They sang because singing was the form their existence took. Competing with them was like competing with weather. The magpies still chattered. Their voices carried the shape of boasting without the content. This too was a kind of record. And then Orpheus. Calliope's leaf did not move, but something in the quality of the grove's stillness shifted slightly when the name came forward in this accounting, even without being spoken aloud. The accounts differ on the father. They do not differ on the mother. She had held an infant in Thrace, and understood what she had made. The infant had cried, and the cry had carried a melody that the birds around them had answered. She had placed her hand on his chest, as the accounts tell it, and felt beneath his ribs the particular rhythm of a heart that would one day descend into the world of the dead, and make even Persephone's composure waver. She had made a musician out of flesh and divine breath combined. He had exceeded what any mortal had managed before him. He had exceeded what most gods managed. What the Muses gave into mortal flesh carried its own weight and its own consequences, and Calliope had understood this when she made the gift. And she had made it anyway. This was also what the Muses left behind. Not safety, not immunity. The gift given without those conditions attached. On the shore of Troy, 17 days of singing. The sea lying still. Thetis and the Nereids in the water, Achilles on the sand, past hearing but not, perhaps, past being heard. Calliope's voice carrying the seed of what would become the Iliad, a war poem that would outlast the war. Outlast the city, outlast every soldier who had stood on either bank of that blood-salted shore. The grief song at Troy was still moving through the world as well. Every lament composed since then had learned something from it, consciously or not, the form of mourning that transforms itself into preservation rather than dissolution. You weep, and in weeping you build the record that the lost person existed. Mnemosyne had known this. The mother of the nine had been the Titaness of all recollection, and she had understood before any of her daughters existed that the problem with grief was not its intensity but its tendency to erase what it mourned. The tears fall and the details blur. She had held all that had ever happened within herself, and she had brought 9 daughters into being whose entire purpose was to make forgetting harder. On the slopes of Helicon, the Hippocrene spring continued its quiet work. Pilgrims drank from it and felt the change. Not inspiration exactly. Something quieter. A readiness to reach for the words that had always been present but had required this particular water, this particular hillside, to become findable. The spring did not give the poets anything. It removed the interference. What the poets found afterward was already theirs. The Muses had arranged for the spring to be here, had gathered around it when Pegasus struck the rock and the water came up, and had made it sacred by their presence and their returning. They returned often. This was not one of those evenings, but the spring was not diminished by their absence from it. A sacred place holds its nature between the visits that sanctified it. The grove held its nature in the same way. An 8th star came. Urania found it in the sky without searching, placed it in the record she kept without keeping, and let it settle. The leaf in Calliope's palm held its position. She was thinking of a blank surface. Not a specific one, the idea of it. The surface that preceded the first line of the first epic. Before the opening word of the Iliad there had been a moment of held stylus. Before the Theogony there had been Hesiod's breath before speech. Before Orpheus's first note on his lyre there had been the silence of a boy learning what his fingers could do. The Muses lived in that interval, before the first word, after the impulse, in the space where the reaching had begun, but the finding had not yet occurred. This was their oldest residence. Not Helicon, not Parnassus, not Pieria, the interval before speech. That was where they had always been, waiting with the patience of things that know the word is coming. Calliope's stylus, in this accounting, hung above the surface. The first word of the first epic waited. It was not in a hurry. It had all of time to arrive, and it would arrive, and when it did, it would carry within it every story the Muses had ever given, compressed into a single gesture of beginning. Rest now. The tale is told. If stories like this bring you peace, subscribing to Olympus Dreams means the next one finds you. The grove continued its slow dark. The note Euterpe held moved through the olive branches and out toward the sea. The leaf in Calliope's open palm held its precise stillness, the veins of it still visible against her skin, the word that had not yet been written suspended in the space just above it.